Recurring through the show is the presence of the family's grandparents, in various forms, and the way Gumball uses the grandparents as a tool against his parents is, on closer inspection, one of the more sophisticated small techniques on this list. The grandparents are, in his framing, a higher authority. The grandparents, in any disagreement, can, by their seniority alone, overrule his parents on certain matters. If Gumball can get the grandparents on side, he can route his asks through them, and the asks, when delivered with grandparental endorsement, are, in functional terms, much harder for his parents to refuse. What he does, in any episode that involves the grandparents, is invest in the relationship. He performs an extra dose of grandchild-shaped affection. He listens, with a patience he does not extend to anybody else, to whatever long story the grandparent is in the mood to tell. He volunteers for small acts of company that his peers would, on their own time, decline. The investment, in his calculation, is paying down the relationship to a point at which, when the ask is made, the grandparent will be in the mood to advocate for him. The advocacy, by way of the grandparent's status, is then almost automatically successful. This is, in adult terms, a very specific kind of political move. He is using a higher node in the family hierarchy to overrule a lower node. The lower node, in this case, is his parents. The higher node is the grandparent. The grandparents, who have, on their own measurement, raised the parents themselves, are, in many small matters, willing to overrule. The willingness is not, in itself, malicious. The grandparents are, in their own framing, just being generous to their grandchild. The fact that the generosity is, in some small way, set up by the grandchild for exactly this purpose is, again, invisible to them. By the end of any grandparent-focused episode, the grandparent has, in some specific small way, used their seniority to grant Gumball something his parents would not have granted on their own. The parents, faced with the grandparental fait accompli, accept it, with the small theatrical resignation the show specializes in. The household, briefly, has been routed around by way of the older generation. Gumball, in the corner of the frame, has the small private satisfaction of having played the family hierarchy correctly. He has outsmarted not his parents, but the structure that placed his parents above him in the family's authority chain. He found, in the grandparent, a node above his parents, and he leaned on it. 48. The Dentist. Somewhere in the show is an episode involving a dental or medical appointment for one of the children, and the way Gumball handles this kind of appointment, in his own quiet way, is by deploying a different sort of outsmarting. The appointment is, by its nature, the kind of event the parents will, by default, enforce. The appointment is, in the household's framing, not negotiable. The way he, in any case, manages the situation is by negotiating the conditions of the appointment rather than the existence of it. He cannot, by his calculation, get out of the appointment itself. He can, however, structure the run-up to the appointment and the aftermath of the appointment in ways that compensate him for the inconvenience. He performs the run-up with a particular brand of small theatrical anxiety, which has, by his measurement, a high probability of triggering a parental treat afterwards. The treat is, in his calculation, the actual prize. The appointment, in itself, is a fixed cost. The treat, after the appointment, is the negotiable variable. He shapes his behavior in advance of the appointment, specifically so that the parents, by the time the appointment is over, have, in their own internal accounting, decided that he deserves something nice. This is, in functional terms, the trick of converting a fixed obligation into a profitable transaction. He has paid the cost of the appointment. He has, in exchange, received a treat that, on a normal day, his parents would not have authorized. The math, in his framing, is positive. He would, on his own terms, rather have had the treat without the appointment. He has, in functional terms, decided that the appointment plus the treat is, on balance, a better day than no appointment and no treat. The parents, who paid for both the appointment and the treat, are operating inside their own internal accounting in which the treat was a reward for his bravery. Both accountings are, in their own way, accurate. The fact that one of the accountings was set up by him in advance is, again, invisible to them. By the end of the appointment-focused episode, the medical or dental matter has, in some form, been resolved, the family is on the way home, and the small treat that was, in some sense, the prize of the day is in his hand. He has outsmarted, again, not the appointment, but the framing of it. The appointment was always going to happen, the treat was not. He arranged the conditions in which the treat became, in his parents' minds, the natural conclusion of the day. 49. The interrupted conversation. Scattered through the show is a small technique that Gumball uses in any conversation in which his parents are about to deliver an unwelcome ruling, and the technique, on careful inspection, is one of the more refined small things on this list. The technique is the interruption that is not, on its surface, an interruption. He does not, when his mother is about to refuse him something, simply talk over her. He, instead, introduces, at the precise small moment before the refusal is delivered, a piece of new information that is, in his framing, urgent. The new information is, often, completely manufactured. It is, in many cases, also true. He has, by direct experiment, worked out that any sufficiently urgent piece of new information will, in his mother's processing, redirect the conversation away from the impending refusal and into the new topic. The refusal, by the time the new topic has been resolved, is no longer in the moment in which it would have been delivered. The moment has passed. The refusal, by the show's quiet logic, lapses. The thing he was about to be refused is, in functional terms, granted by default, by way of his mother's failure to circle back. This is, again, a small calibrated piece of social engineering. He is not lying about the new information. He is choosing, with great care, when to introduce it. The choice is the manipulation. The information, in itself, is, often, perfectly real. He has saved up, in advance, a small piece of news that he knew he could deploy when needed. The deployment, when it happens, has the precise effect he intended. The household, after the new topic has been resolved, has, in some functional sense, forgotten the original conversation. The original ask is, in some quiet way, simply still standing. By the end of any episode that hinges on this kind of move, Gumball has, again, achieved the outcome he wanted. His parents have, again, not registered that the outcome was set up by way of a small attentive piece of interruption work, and the household has again returned to its standard shape. He has outsmarted, in a small specific way, the conversational structure of his own home. He has learned that, in any conversation in his household, the order of topics is more important than the content. He has learned to control the order. He uses the learning, very quietly, every day. 50. The borrowed item. Recurring through the show is an episode pattern involving Gumball borrowing something from his parents, either explicitly or implicitly, and the way he handles the return of the item, in the aftermath, is one of the more consistent small examples of him outsmarting his parents on this list. The borrowed item is, in his framing, the perfect small canvas. The item has a known owner. The item has a known condition at the moment of borrowing. The item has, by the time he is finished with it, a slightly different condition. The slightly different is, in his calculation, the entire problem. The way he handles this is by way of selective return. He does not, when returning the item, present its full current condition. He, by way of placement, by way of timing, by way of the conditions under which the item is returned to the parental gaze, edits the moment of return so that the slightly different condition is, in functional terms, invisible. The item, when noticed by his parents, will be noticed at a time when they are not in the mood to inspect closely. The item, by the time they are in the mood to inspect closely, will have been further obscured by other small events. The slightly different condition, in the end, becomes, by way of slow erosion of attention, the new normal condition. The parents, weeks later, will not remember exactly what the item looked like before he borrowed it. The matter, in functional terms, closes itself. This is, in adult terms, the slow burial of a problem under time. He has worked out that, in his parents' household, any small condition change that is not immediately noticed will, in the long run, become, by default, the new condition. The household's collective memory of what the item used to look like is, on his measurement, not durable. He has used the lack of durability, episode after episode, to launder small returns into clean returns by way of the simple passage of weeks. By the end of any episode that touches this pattern, the item is, in some form, in its place. The condition issue is, in some form, no longer being discussed. and the household is, in some form, operating as if nothing happened. Gumball, in his own memory, knows what happened. The parents, in their memory, do not. He has outsmarted, again, not the specific moment, but the household's ability to maintain a record of itself across time. The record, in his hands, has become flexible. He uses the flexibility every chance he gets. 51. The Mother's Day. In the show's tradition is an episode that addresses Mother's Day, in some form, and the way Gumball handles this kind of episode is, on this list, one of the more emotionally complicated entries. He is, again, performing the work of preparing a day that is, on its surface, for his mother. He is, again, doing it by way of careful reading of what she will value. He is, again, doing it with the small private double awareness that the performance is, on some level, also a form of deposit into the long-term emotional account that he, separately, intends to draw on later. The shape of the Mother's Day episode, in his hands, is, again, the same shape as the careful birthday plans he occasionally constructs for his father. The skill is the skill. The intention is, in this case, kind. The kindness is real. The cost of the kindness is that the kindness has been engineered, and the engineering, by its existence, is, on some level, evidence that he is capable of the engineering. The fact that he engineers kindness on this particular Sunday does not, in any clean way, prove that the rest of the year is sincere. The show, with its usual quiet honesty, lets you sit with this. What is gentle about the Mother's Day episode is that, by the end of it, Nicole is, in her own way, deeply moved. She has, by the end of the day, decided that her son loves her in a way she had perhaps forgotten he was capable of loving her. The decision is, in her terms, completely accurate. He does love her in that way. The decision is also, in her terms, incomplete. He loves her in that way, and he is, in another way, the kid who is going to lie to her about a school report on Tuesday. Both of these things are true at the same time. He has, on Mother's Day, outsmarted himself into being, for one day, the version of him that the rest of the year can occasionally reach for. The version is real. It is also, on the other days, partial. By the end of the Mother's Day episode, the day has, in some form, concluded. The mother has, in some form, been honored, and the household has, in some form, returned to its standard rhythm. Gumball, in his own quiet way, has, in this episode, perhaps outsmarted himself the most. He has, by way of an entire day of focused emotional accuracy, demonstrated to himself that the techniques he uses every day to manage his parents could, in principle, be redirected. The fact that he does not, in fact, redirect them every day is, on this list, the most quietly honest thing about his character. 52. The redirection. Recurring across the show is a technique that Gumball uses in any household disagreement that has, by some accident, become a 2-against-1 situation against him. And the technique is, on careful inspection, one of the more sophisticated small plays on this list. The technique is the parental redirection. He does not, when faced with a unified parental front, attempt to defeat both parents at once. He, instead, very quietly, introduces a small disagreement between them. He has, by long observation, worked out exactly which subjects Richard and Nicole disagree on. He knows the small recurring fault lines in their marriage. He knows which household decisions, when raised at the wrong time, will, in functional terms, redirect their argument away from him and into each other. He has, by direct experiment, learned to deploy these subjects at the precise small moment when the parental front is closing in. The effect is that, by the time the disagreement is resolved, the parents have, in some form, talked through their own thing, and the original matter, the matter that was about him, is, in some quiet way, no longer central. This is, in adult terms, a piece of family politics that is, on its face, faintly horrifying when you stop to look at it. He is, with deliberate skill, weaponizing small marital frictions to deflect parental attention. The frictions are not invented. They are, in the show's own observation, real. He is just choosing when to surface them. The surfacing, in his framing, is, on a particular evening, more useful to him than the original disagreement was costly. He pays a small cost in household harmony, in the short term, to win his own argument. The The show, with the kindness it extends to almost everything, lets this play unfold with very little overt judgment. The parents, who are not actively malicious, do not, mostly, register that they have been played. They register, in some form, that the household has been, on this evening, slightly more tense than usual, and they move on. The fact that the tension was, in some quiet way, manufactured by their son for his own protection is, again, invisible to them. By the end of any episode that touches this dynamic, the household is, in some form, resettled, and Gumball, in his own corner, has banked the small win. 53. The 11th hour. Recurring through the show is the technique of the very late confession. The shape of it is that Gumball, having spent an entire episode constructing and maintaining a particular small lie, at some point near the end of the episode, voluntarily, with great theatrical sincerity, confesses to the lie. The confession is, on its surface, an act of conscience. The confession is, on closer inspection, a calculated piece of damage control. He has worked out, in advance, that confessing the lie himself at the 11th hour is, in functional terms, much cheaper than having the lie exposed by his parents. The 11th hour confession is, in its own way, one of the more honest entries on this list, because Gumball is, in this case, openly using sincerity as a tool. He has decided, by his own reading of his parents, that they will, when faced with a voluntary confession, soften the consequence. They will give him credit for honesty. They will say, in their gentle parental way, that what matters is that he came forward. The household, in receipt of the confession, will, on its standard pattern, forgive him at a much lower price than the price the lie was about to cost him. This is, in functional terms, an arbitrage. He has identified a price difference between two versions of the same event. The lie exposed by parents costs more than the lie confessed by the child. He has, by direct experiment, established the difference. He pockets the difference, episode after episode, by confessing late but voluntarily. The technique requires a kind of dramatic flair, which he has, and a willingness to absorb a small visible cost in pride in exchange for a much larger invisible cost in punishment. He has, by long practice, made the trade smoothly. By the end of any episode that hinges on this kind of move, the small confession has, in some form, been delivered. The parents have, in some form, forgiven him at a discount, and the household has, in some form, accepted the resolution. He has outsmarted, again, not just his parents, but the entire moral economy of his own household. The household, in its standard accounting, treats voluntary honesty as worth more than involuntary honesty. He has, by being honest on his own timing rather than on his parents' timing, captured the difference. The household, with its usual sweetness, never quite catches the arbitrage. The show, with its usual fairness, lets you see it. 54. The accumulated history. In the show's quiet logic is a final small technique that runs underneath every other entry on this list, and the technique is the deployment of accumulated history. Gumball has, by the late seasons of the show, lived inside the Watterson household long enough that he has built up, in his own head, a complete map of who his parents have, in their lives, been at every previous point. He remembers, in a way they often do not, the things they said years ago. He remembers, in a way they often do not, the promises they made in particular moments. He remembers, in a way they often do not, the precedents they set on small Saturdays that, in the present moment, can be invoked as binding rules. The way he uses this, in argument, is one of the more sophisticated small moves of his late series behavior. He cites them to themselves. He reminds his mother, at a key moment, of a thing she said in a softer mood, in a different season, that, in the present moment, she would not have said. He reminds his father, at a key moment, of a thing his father, in a flush of generosity, once committed to. The reminding is, in functional terms, a kind of contract enforcement. He is holding them to versions of themselves they have, in the meantime, drifted away from. This is, on one level, almost adult of him. He is treating the household as a place with its own internal precedents, its own internal common law, and he is, in arguments, citing the case law back at the parents who, in their own forgetfulness, are no longer the authors of it. They are, in his framing, just the current administrators. The household's actual constitution lives in his memory, not in theirs. He has, by way of remembering more carefully than they do, become, in small ways, the keeper of the family's record. The keeper, in any argument, has an asymmetric advantage. He has the receipts. They do not. By the end of any episode that touches this kind of move, the precedent has, in some form, been invoked. The parents, in some form, have softened to accommodate it. And Gumball, in his own quiet way, has won a round that, by any fair fight on the present day's merits, he would have lost. He has outsmarted, again, not the present situation, but the household's collective inattention to its own history. The household, in his hands, has become a place where the past, carefully selected, is a usable weapon. He has been arming himself with his parents' own words for years. The show, in its quiet honesty, lets the arming happen on screen. The parents, mostly, do not notice that they have been arming him. 55. The mood read. Finally, there is a technique that Gumball uses every day of his life inside the household, and the technique is the simplest and the most important one on this list. Before he enters a room, he has, by way of small signals, by way of tone of voice from down the hallway, by way of the speed at which footsteps are moving across the kitchen tile, formed a working hypothesis about which version of his mother and which version of his father he is about to walk into. The hypothesis, by direct experiment over years, is usually correct. He calibrates his entrance accordingly. What this means, in practice, is that almost every interaction he has with his parents has been, in some quiet way, prepared in advance. The tone he uses when he walks in, the topic he leads with, the small expression on his face, have all been selected, in the second before the doorway, to match the household weather that he has detected from the hall. He is, in functional terms, calibrating his own entrance to the room's current emotional climate. The room, by being entered correctly, becomes, in some small way, easier to navigate than it would have been had he entered without preparation. This is, in adult terms, the work of an attentive partner, an experienced negotiator, a skilled diplomat. It is also, in his case, the unconscious habit of a child who has lived long enough inside one household to have learned, almost without trying, every one of its small recurring weather patterns. He is not, in this technique, doing anything dishonest. He is just paying attention. The attention, by its existence, gives him an advantage. His parents, who have, in their own lives, not had the equivalent reverse training on him, are operating with less information than he is. By the end of any episode, of any season, of the entire run of the show, this is, in the end, the deepest thing Gumball does to outsmart his parents. He pays attention to them, all the time, with a kind of low-grade constant focus that they, busy with the rest of their lives, do not pay back. The asymmetry is the technique. The asymmetry is, in some sense, the entire engine of the show. He is, all the time, watching. He is, all the time, reading. He is, all the time, adjusting. They are, all the time, doing the best they can. The best they can is, on most days, not as informationally complete as the worst he could come up with. He wins the small rounds. They, in some quieter way, win the larger arc, by loving him through every one of his small wins, regardless. And here, after all of this counting, after all of these small techniques and large techniques, after the mustache and the DVD and the sock and the signed permission slip, and the 11th hour confession, and the carefully timed compliment delivered in a mother's quietly satisfied moment in front of a mirror, you start to see that the title of this video has, all along, been a kind of friendly misdirection. Gumball Watterson outsmarts his parents constantly. He outsmarts his parents every day of his life. He has been outsmarting his parents since the first time he learned that a small visual signal can rewrite the role he is being read in, and he will go on outsmarting them, in some smaller and more refined way, for as long as he lives inside their house. But the show, the actual show, the years of episodes that this list has been touching, is not, in the end, a celebration of his cleverness. It is something quieter and stranger and more honest. It is a long, slow argument that the very thing that makes him capable of outsmarting his parents, the close attention, the careful reading, the accumulated map of their habits and their weather and their words, is also the very thing that makes him, in the end, their son. He could not have learned to manipulate them without first having learned to love them very closely. The two skills, in his small life, are inseparable. The show, in its quietest moments, suggests that they might be inseparable in any household. The kid who never learns to manipulate his parents at all is, possibly, the kid who never learned to pay attention to them in the first place. The fact that the attention can also be used as a tool is, in some sense, the price of being raised in a family that is, in any meaningful way, intimate. The Amazing World of Gumball, in this long view, is a show about a kid who has been very carefully watching his parents for years. The watching produced, on the comedy side, every small trick on this list: the mustache, the DVD, the refund, the curse, the quest, the words, the plan, the genius, the job, the best, the money, the choices, the pony, the boredom, the worst, the apology, the saint, the pressure, the egg, the sock, the signature, the phone, the Halloween, the vacation, the console, the heist, the cringe, the lie, the school report, the sick day, the allowance, the sleepover, the Christmas, the grades, the chore, the crush, the fake friend, the pet, the car, the compliment, the recipe, the shopping trip, the dishes, the babysitter, the bedtime, the Halloween haul, the grandparent, the dentist, the interrupted conversation, the borrowed item, the Mother's Day, the redirection, the 11th hour, the accumulated history, the mood read, the watching produced. On the other side, the love. The two sides of the watching are, in this show, the same watching. The show, after 6 seasons, came to its quiet end. The kids did not stop being kids. The household, by all reports, kept running. The promise of more to come, in some form, hangs over the show's future, and we will, as we always do on this channel, wait for what arrives without rushing to call any of it canon before it is canon. What we know for certain, from what the show actually gave us, is that a quiet little house in a quiet little town held inside it, for years, a son who was paying very, very close attention to his parents, and who used that attention in every possible direction, sometimes to deceive them, sometimes to protect them, sometimes to surprise them with a day they did not expect to be so well planned, sometimes to manage them through a long Tuesday they did not realize they were being managed through. The Amazing World of Gumball, in the end, is not about a clever kid winning every argument with his parents. It is about a household in which the people, on both sides of the kitchen table, are doing the best they can, with the imperfect information they have, to live alongside each other without breaking anything that cannot be repaired. Gumball, on his side, is doing it by way of his small, unending campaign of cleverness. Richard and Nicole, on theirs, are doing it by way of the small, unending campaign of letting him try. The fact that the household, by the end of the series, is still standing, is not, in the show's quiet logic, a sign that anybody outsmarted anybody. It is a sign that everybody, in their own small, careful way, agreed to keep the household going. The agreement is not stated. The agreement is just, in every small frame of the show, demonstrated. So we have, tonight, walked together through every time Gumball outsmarted his parents, and we have, by the end of the walk, perhaps arrived at the gentler reading. The outsmarting is not, in this show, the same thing as winning. The outsmarting is, in this show, the visible surface of a much larger thing that is going on underneath, which is the long, slow business of a child growing up inside a particular family and learning, in real time, every one of its small, honest patterns. The patterns can be exploited. The patterns can also be cherished. He does, by turns, both. The show, with its usual quiet honesty, lets both readings stand. We can choose, in our own quiet evenings, which one we want to take with us into the rest of the week. Let the night settle around you now. Let the house in your head, whatever house that is, hold itself together for a few more hours. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. There is a show that aired on the Disney Channel for 2 seasons, where a sentient pickle and a sentient peanut share a refrigerator and sing songs about hot dogs, and the cabinets behind them are real photographs of real cabinets. And a lot of people, when they first saw the trailer, said the same 3 words at the same time. They said, "That is just Gumball." Tonight on Cortoon, we are going through every cartoon that has been accused of being a Gumball ripoff. The famous ones that got cancelled fast, the obscure foreign knockoffs that copied the family almost directly, the same studio cousins that everybody quietly forgives, and the one episode where Gumball itself stared straight down the lens and made the whole list of accusations for you. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, settle in, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. The Amazing World of Gumball is, at heart, a show built out of constraints. When Ben Bocquelet first pitched it to Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe in London, the idea was to take a stack of rejected character designs from old commercial work, drop them into a single family, and let them collide. The blue cat had been pitched somewhere else and rejected. The fish brother had been pitched somewhere else and rejected. The rabbit father had been pitched somewhere else and rejected. The mixed media approach, the way you end up with a flat two-dimensional cat sitting at a kitchen table that was photographed in someone's actual house, was, in part, a budget decision. It is cheaper to photograph a real living room than to design one from scratch. It is cheaper to drop a stock photograph of grass into the background than to paint a field by hand. The show is, in a particular way, an exercise in making a virtue out of a limited budget, and the show is the better for it. What came out of those constraints was something that nobody else on television looked like. A cat that was clearly drawn on a tablet was sitting on a couch that was clearly a real couch, in a town that was clearly photographed in some suburb of nowhere in particular, while a bus driven by what looked like a stop-motion puppet trundled past a sign that might as well have been a Photoshop tutorial. Every single shot was a layered collage. Every single character belonged to a different visual medium, and the show never explained it. There was no episode where someone sat the family down and said, "This town is strange because we are all drawn in different art styles." The strangeness was just the floor. The strangeness was the air the show breathed. This is the thing you have to understand if you want to understand the ripoff discourse that came later. Gumball did not invent mixed media animation. Plenty of shows before it had used photographic textures, or live-action backgrounds, or different character styles colliding in the same frame. But Gumball was the show that took the mixed media approach and made it look like the cheapest, simplest, easiest thing in the world. The illusion of simplicity is part of why every cartoon executive in the early 2010s looked at Gumball, did a quick bit of math, and said, "We could do that. We could do that for less. We could do that on our network. We could do that next year, and have it on the air by the following autumn." What they missed, and what nearly every show that tried to follow Gumball missed, was that the show only works because of the writing. The mixed media is a costume. Underneath the costume is a sitcom written with the care of a prestige drama and the absurdity of a sketch show. Underneath the costume is a family that genuinely loves one another in the way real families do, which means most of their interactions are accidentally cruel or accidentally tender. And underneath the costume is a tone that knows exactly when to break the fourth wall and exactly when to leave it alone. The mixed media is what gets you to click on the show in the first place. The writing is what makes you stay through 6 seasons of it. So when somebody says a show is a Gumball ripoff, they usually mean 2 things at the same time. They mean that the show looks like Gumball in some visual sense, the photo backgrounds, the stock images of food, the flat 2-dimensional character sitting in a 3-dimensional photographic space. And they also mean that the show fails to land in the same way that Gumball lands. The accusation is rarely just, "You stole the style." The accusation is, "You stole the style and you did not earn it. You picked up the costume, you put it on, and it hung wrong on you, because the body underneath was not the same body." That is the thesis I want to keep returning to over the next couple of hours, because it is the most useful lens for thinking about what counts as a ripoff and what does not. A look is not a soul. A photograph in the background is not, by itself, theft. But there is a real conversation to be had about a decade of cartoons that all somehow looked vaguely like the same show. And that conversation is more interesting than the easy version, which is just pointing at things and saying, "That is also Gumball." We are going to take the long way around. We are going to start with the famous offenders, then drift out to the strange ones, then end up at the ones you have probably never heard of, the ones from other countries, the ones that pulled videos down before anyone could screenshot them. And before any of that, we are going to talk about the strangest entry in this whole list, which is the episode where Gumball itself looked at the ripoff industry, picked up a mirror, and pointed it back at every show on this list at once. Because Gumball, like a lot of shows that get widely copied, eventually became aware of being copied, and the way it responded to that awareness is genuinely one of the most peculiar things any animated sitcom has ever done. There is an episode, by most accounts in the 5th season, called The Copycats. It exists, it is canon, and it is structured around a premise so on the nose that, when you read the description back to yourself, you assume the writers are joking, until you remember that the writers of this particular show are almost always joking and always serious at the same time. The premise of The Copycats, as the show presents it, is that the Wattersons have discovered there is a knockoff version of their family on television. Not a parody, not a tribute, not a careful homage. A direct, blatant, lazy ripoff, with all the names changed by a single letter, all the designs flattened into something simpler and worse, and the whole tone of the original replaced with something safer and more generic. The family watches this knockoff version of themselves and reacts the way real creators react when they see their work being copied without credit. They are insulted. They are furious. They are also, in the way Gumball always is, a little impressed at how brazen the whole thing is. Because the knockoff is not trying to hide what it is. It is just trying to make money by being a slightly worse version of something that already existed and that already worked. What makes the episode genuinely interesting, as a piece of meta-commentary, is what the episode does not do. It does not lift up a sign with the names of any of the famous American imitators printed on it. It does not, at any point, name-check Pickle and Peanut, or Bunsen, or any of the other shows that fans had been accusing for years. Instead, the episode aims its specific satire at the world of international knockoffs, framing the in-show ripoff as an animated series produced overseas, which lets the writers be very direct about the practice of foreign content farms tracing the Watterson family without having to pick a fight with another American network. The point that emerges, even through that one specific target, is sharper than any narrower accusation could be. A ripoff is not just a theft of style or of character or of premise. A ripoff is a theft of attention. The ripoff is doing the same job as the original, but in a way that fills the same slot in someone's day with something less. The ripoff is taking up the channel space, the streaming carousel space, the search result space, that would otherwise go to the original or to something genuinely new. And the joke the episode keeps circling is that even the Wattersons, who are sitting on the couch being insulted by this knockoff version of themselves, cannot stop watching it. They are appalled, and they are still watching. Read this way. The Copycats becomes one of the most quietly self-aware episodes the show ever did. The argument it implies, although it never says it out loud, is that the ripoff exists because there is a hole in the audience that the original cannot fill anymore. Because the original is busy being itself. Television always wants more of the thing that worked, and if the people who made the thing that worked will not, or cannot, or are not allowed to make more of it fast enough, then somebody else will be hired to make a cheaper version, and that cheaper version will fill the hole the original left behind, and the audience will resent it and consume it in roughly equal measure. The episode does not present this as a tragedy. It presents it as a kind of natural cycle of the industry. Things that worked get copied. The copies get derided. The copies sometimes get canceled. And then, a few years later, the cycle starts again with whatever has worked next. There is a moment, late in the episode, where the show seems to gently let the ripoff off the hook. It does not endorse the copying. It does not say, "Oh, this is fine." But it does, in the show's typical way, acknowledge that the people making the ripoff are not necessarily villains. They are mostly artists who have been hired by a network to make something that someone else thought was going to be popular. They are doing the job they were hired for. The villain, if there is one, is the broader system that keeps deciding that the way to make a successful cartoon is to find another successful cartoon and make it again, slightly worse, on a different channel. The villain is not the imitator. The villain is the imitation economy. And before we leave the meta side of all this and start actually walking through the famous accused offenders one by one, it is worth flagging something else that the episode quietly implies, which is that Gumball itself is, in some senses, a kind of ripoff too. The show was built, openly and proudly, out of designs that had been pitched to other places and rejected. The mixed media style, although Gumball perfected it, did not originate with Gumball. The family sitcom format is the oldest format in animation. There is no cartoon that is not, in some sense, downstream of something else. The Wattersons themselves are arguably descendants of The Simpsons, who are arguably descendants of the Flintstones, who are arguably descendants of the Honeymooners. Every animated family is a copy of an animated family. The question is never whether you copied. The question is what you added. And that is the question we are going to keep asking, over and over, for every show on this list. What did this show add? What did it subtract? What does it have that Gumball does not? What does Gumball have that it does not? And when the answer is nothing, the show is just a worse Gumball, then the accusation of being a ripoff starts to feel earned, not because the show stole a style, but because the show borrowed a style and did not give anything back in return. Style ownership is, in some sense, a thing nobody really has. But style debt, where you take a look that someone else worked very hard to build and you use it to cut your own production cost, is a thing that audiences feel even when they cannot articulate it. The famous accused offenders of the next 10 years all share that feeling. They all feel like style debts that were never repaid. So let us start with the show that, when most people think about the words Gumball ripoff, is the first show that surfaces in their head. The show that lasted exactly 2 seasons on Disney XD. The show that became a meme almost before it premiered. The show about a pickle and a peanut who live in a refrigerator and sing about food, and that has, on its very first day on air, been the central exhibit in this entire conversation ever since. Pickle and Peanut premiered on Disney XD in September of 2015, and from the very first promotional images, the comparison to Gumball was already being made. The reasons were structural, and they were obvious. The show was a buddy comedy. The 2 main characters were a pickle and a peanut, both anthropomorphic, both drawn flat in a deliberately simple style, both clearly inspired by the kind of cheap and surreal humor that had been working for Cartoon Network across the previous 5 years. Then, behind the 2 characters, there were the backgrounds. The backgrounds were not painted. The backgrounds were not designed. The backgrounds were, in many cases, photographs of real shelves, real cabinets, real grocery stores, real refrigerators, real fast food restaurants. The pickle and the peanut were 2 flat little drawings dropped into a world that had been photographed rather than built. If you have any familiarity with the way Gumball worked, you can already feel why the comparison was instant. Gumball had made the photographed background into one of its signatures. The Wattersons walked through a photographed Elmore on a daily basis. The school they went to was photographed. The kitchen they argued in was photographed. The world of Gumball was a collage in exactly the way the world of Pickle and Peanut was a collage. And the visual style of the 2 main characters, although they did not look identical to anyone in the Watterson family, looked like they belonged in the same dollar bin of cartoon character design. The 2 shows shared a kind of intentional crudeness. They both wanted to look like they had been thrown together quickly, even though, in Gumball's case, the actual production was anything but quick. Pickle and Peanut was created by Noah Z. Jones, who had previously created Fish Hooks for Disney, which is a show that has its own loyal audience and its own slightly mixed media feel, with cartoon fish characters layered onto photographs of bubbles and water. Fish Hooks premiered roughly half a year before Gumball, so it is fair to say that some of the mixed media language was bouncing around the industry at the same time on multiple shows, and that not every show that uses a photographic background is necessarily reaching for Gumball specifically. But Pickle and Peanut, by the time it premiered in 2015, was 4 years downstream of Gumball, and 4 years was more than enough time for everyone in animation to have absorbed what Gumball was doing. The reception of Pickle and Peanut was, to put it as gently as the format allows, hostile. The critical response was that the show was a Gumball clone with worse jokes. The audience response landed in the same place. And the meme response, which is the response that matters most in these kinds of debates, was that the show was a Gumball clone with worse jokes. There were YouTube essays. There were side-by-side comparisons. There were entire forum threads dedicated to cataloging every visual element of Pickle and Peanut that could be traced back to a corresponding visual element in Gumball. And there were just as many threads pushing back on this, arguing that mixed media was bigger than Gumball, that surreal humor was bigger than Gumball, and that the show deserved to exist on its own terms, even if those terms were not particularly impressive. What is worth saying, though, in the spirit of being fair to a show that nobody felt much affection for, is that Pickle and Peanut was trying to do something different from Gumball in at least one specific way. The show leaned much harder into the random, gross-out, internet meme style of humor. There were songs, there were celebrity guests, there were huge digressive moments where the show would suddenly stop being a narrative and start being a music video or a sketch. Gumball did some of this, especially in the later seasons, but Gumball almost always grounded its weirdness in family. The Wattersons were always the center of gravity. Pickle and Peanut did not really have a center of gravity. The Pickle was the loud one, and the Peanut was the anxious one, and the show jumped around between settings and genres and tones with the kind of energy that the network presumably thought would appeal to children with shorter attention spans than the children who were watching Gumball. In hindsight, this is the most useful thing to say about Pickle and Peanut. It looked like Gumball, but it did not want to be Gumball. It wanted to be a kind of internet absurdist machine that ran at a higher speed and a lower depth than Gumball ran at. Gumball was a show that took a lot of swings at the heart. Pickle and Peanut almost never took a swing at the heart. The Pickle and the Peanut were not, in any meaningful way, a family. They were just roommates in a refrigerator. The show did not have access to the emotional engine that made Gumball work, partly because of choice and partly because of constraint. And what that meant, in the end, was that Pickle and Peanut had all of Gumball's surface, but none of its core, and audiences felt that absence even when they could not articulate it. The show was canceled after 2 seasons, and it has largely been remembered as a kind of cultural mistake. The show whose only real legacy is being the example everyone reaches for when they want to define what a Gumball ripoff actually is. There is a real argument to be made that Pickle and Peanut would have been treated better, critically, if Gumball had never existed. The show was not, on its own merits, a complete disaster. There were jokes that landed. There were episodes that had a real visual energy. But because Gumball did exist, and because Gumball was sitting right next to it on the dial, doing the same kind of visual trick more confidently and more carefully, Pickle and Peanut was condemned by comparison before it ever had a chance to make its own case. There is a sad small detail in the history of Pickle and Peanut that is worth pausing on, because it captures something about how these kinds of shows tend to die. By the end of its run, the show had clearly burned through whatever budget enthusiasm Disney had given it at the start. Episodes started arriving with longer stretches of stock photograph background and less actual animation. The Pickle and the Peanut spent more and more time standing in front of unchanging photographic walls, talking through what felt like padded scenes. The show that had been accused of mimicking Gumball ended up doing something that Gumball, even at its most low budget, never had to do, which was simply giving up on the layering and putting the characters in front of a static picture for entire scenes. It is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that makes the ripoff accusation land harder. Pickle and Peanut had taken the look and could not maintain it. Gumball had built the look from scratch and could maintain it for 6 seasons. We are going to keep this fairness running throughout the rest of the essay, because the easy version of this video would be to spend 2 hours just dunking on shows that did not deserve to exist. The harder, more interesting version is to ask, every time, what each of these shows was actually trying to do, and where each of them fell short. Pickle and Peanut was trying to be a faster, weirder, more internet-shaped cartoon than Gumball. It failed because it could not write characters that anyone cared about. That failure has nothing to do with whether or not the backgrounds were photographed. The photography is the symptom. The cause is somewhere else entirely. And we are going to keep digging at that cause as we move through the next show on the list. A show that is, in some ways, even more notorious than Pickle and Peanut, even though it lasted only a single season, and even though the person who created it had been one of the most successful cartoon creators of the previous 15 years. Bunsen is a Beast premiered on Nickelodeon in the early days of 2017, and it had, on paper, the kind of pedigree that should have made it a hit. It was created by Butch Hartman, who at that point had already given Nickelodeon 2 of its biggest properties of the previous 2 decades, The Fairly OddParents and Danny Phantom. He was, by any reasonable industry measure, a proven hand. He had a recognizable style. He had a recognizable sense of humor. He had a track record that spanned hundreds of episodes of children's animation. And yet the show he made about a friendly monster going to a human school turned into one of the most aggressively dismissed cartoons of its era, and one of the shows that, in the broader online conversation, has been folded into the Gumball ripoff list with surprising consistency. The premise of Bunsen is a Beast is that a small blue furry monster called Bunsen enrolls at a regular human middle school, becomes best friends with a human boy called Mikey, and has to navigate the everyday humiliations of being a furry blue monster in a school full of children who are not. There is a bully who hates him on sight and wants him gone. There is a school that more or less reluctantly accepts him. There are episodic adventures that range from the surreal to the gross, and there is, throughout the show, a kind of frantic energy that suggests the writers were always pushing a little bit harder than the material actually wanted to be pushed. The Gumball comparison, in this case, is not really about photographed backgrounds. Bunsen does not use the same mixed media approach. Its world is, for the most part, a more traditionally drawn animated world. The comparison instead lives in the structural choices the show makes. A non-human character lives in a town full of humans and weirder non-humans, with the show treating that arrangement as just the normal state of affairs, much the way Gumball treats Elmore. A small main character has a best friend who is essentially a brother, much the way Gumball has Darwin. There is a school setting that mirrors the way Gumball uses Elmore Junior High. There is a tone of escalating absurdity that, on a surface level, feels like it is reaching for the same comedic frequency as Gumball, without ever quite locking onto it. What hurt Bunsen more than the comparison itself, and probably more than any of the actual creative choices in the show, was the timing of its release. By 2017, Gumball was already deep into its run. The show had a very loyal and very vocal fan base, and that fan base had become, by then, extremely attuned to anything that looked like an attempt to imitate the formula. Bunsen walked straight into that attentive audience, on a competing network, with a buddy comedy structure and an outsider main character, and that audience reacted to it the way you would expect. They picked it apart. They flagged every similarity, every structural overlap, every joke that felt like a watered-down version of a joke they had already seen. The reception was loud and it was harsh, and the show was canceled after one season. It is worth pausing here, because the Butch Hartman situation has another layer to it that affects the way Bunsen tends to be remembered. In the years that followed the cancellation of Bunsen, Hartman ran a crowd-funded animation streaming project that ran into significant public controversy over the way it was promoted and the way refunds were eventually handled. That controversy is documented and was widely discussed online, and the timing of it means that, when many viewers think back on Bunsen now, they remember it through the lens of the later controversy rather than on its own terms. This is not entirely fair to the show. Bunsen is not, in itself, worse because of anything its creator did later. The show is what the show is, but the broader narrative around Butch Hartman during the late 2010s added a layer of suspicion to everything he made in that period, and Bunsen has not escaped that suspicion. When you actually sit and watch Bunsen, separated from the discourse around it, the most interesting thing is how clearly it is not really a Gumball ripoff at all. It is a Butch Hartman show. It looks like a Butch Hartman show. It moves like a Butch Hartman show. Its jokes are pitched at the same audience that watched Fairly Odd Parents. Its color palette, its character design vocabulary, its pacing, all of it descends from a tradition of Nickelodeon comedies that have nothing in common with Gumball other than the broad genre of being a cartoon for children. The accusation that Bunsen is a Gumball ripoff is, in some sense, a kind of category error. The real accusation, if you want to be precise about it, is that Bunsen looked like an attempt to compete with Gumball, to take the same audience demographic and offer them a different show in a similar emotional bracket. That is not the same thing as a ripoff. That is a market response. But the broader internet conversation does not generally bother to distinguish between those two things. What the Bunsen situation reveals, more than anything, is that the Gumball ripoff accusation by 2017 had become a kind of catch-all. Any animated show on any rival network that featured an outsider character, and a best friend, and a school setting, and any kind of mildly surreal sense of humor, was by then almost automatically going to be tagged with the comparison. The accusation had drifted from specific visual theft, the photographed background sort of thing, into a much vaguer category of, "This reminds me of Gumball in some way I cannot fully articulate." That vagueness was a sign that the accusation was running out of road. It was about to start picking up shows that genuinely had nothing to do with Gumball at all. And, in the case of one of the shows we are about to talk about, it had already started doing that, even before Gumball itself had finished its first season. Almost Naked Animals is the show that complicates the entire ripoff timeline, and the show that, if you bring it up in any online conversation about Gumball ripoffs, immediately drags the conversation back to a question of dates. Because Almost Naked Animals premiered in Canada in January of 2011, which is to say, before The Amazing World of Gumball premiered on Cartoon Network in May of that same year. Strictly speaking, on the calendar, you cannot rip off a show that has not yet aired. And yet, somehow, Almost Naked Animals tends to end up in the same lists, in the same essays, in the same comparison threads, alongside the shows that actually came after Gumball and that actually had access to Gumball as a template. The show was produced in Canada, made by 9 Story Entertainment, and built around a hotel run by animals who, true to the title, wear underwear and effectively nothing else. The cast is a rotating crew of mostly mammal characters, with a few birds and reptiles thrown in, and the humor leans extremely heavily into broad slapstick and high-energy chaos. The visual style is a flat, deliberately simple two-dimensional approach that is more reminiscent of late 2000s Flash animation than of the layered mixed media of Gumball. The backgrounds, on the whole, are drawn, not photographed. The character designs are noisy and round in a way that, again, has more in common with the broader Flash animation moment of that era than with anything Ben Bocquelet was doing in London. So why does this show end up in the Gumball ripoff conversation at all? The honest answer is, mostly, because it has animal characters, because it is set in a kind of slightly unhinged service environment that recalls the broader sense of place that Gumball uses for Elmore, and because the people making YouTube videos about Gumball ripoffs in the late 2010s were not necessarily paying close attention to the calendar. The inclusion of Almost Naked Animals on the ripoff list is one of those things that happens when a piece of internet folklore solidifies into a list before anyone checks the receipts. Once the list exists, the list propagates, and corrections to the list propagate much more slowly than the original list ever did. There is a real thing worth saying about Almost Naked Animals on its own terms, though, because it functions as a kind of useful counterexample for the whole ripoff debate. Almost Naked Animals is a show that absolutely did exist in the same cultural moment as Gumball. It absolutely did try to operate in roughly the same broad lane of slightly absurdist all-ages animation aimed at children with some grown-up jokes for parents. It absolutely did, in some senses, fail to find the audience that Gumball found. And yet, when you look at the two shows side by side, the differences are far more interesting than the similarities. Almost Naked Animals has no real love for its characters. It does not slow down. It does not allow for the kind of quiet melancholy moments that Gumball, at its best, leans into. It is, more or less, a high-speed slapstick engine with a hotel as its premise. Gumball, by contrast, is a family drama that occasionally puts a high-speed slapstick engine in the middle of the kitchen. The two shows live in different emotional registers, even though, from a great distance, they can be made to look like they belong to the same general species. If anything, Almost Naked Animals is best understood as one of a wave of slightly absurd animal-centric cartoons that all premiered within a year or two of each other across the Western television landscape, and that all share some surface similarities, not because anyone was copying anyone, but because the broader industry had landed on a certain kind of design vocabulary at roughly the same time. The early 2010s was a moment in which a lot of animated comedies decided that the safest creative direction was to put weird animals in mundane situations and let the contrast generate the comedy. Gumball was one of those shows. Almost Naked Animals was another. Many others were quietly in development at the same time, some of which never made it to air, some of which had short runs and were forgotten. The whole wave shares a family resemblance the way a litter of puppies does. The puppies are not copies of each other. They just have the same parents, which in this case were the broader industry conditions of children's animation in 2010 and 2011. That family resemblance is, in some sense, where most of the genuine rip-off arguments fall apart on closer inspection. Cartoons borrow from each other constantly. They borrow from the same set of historical templates: the family sitcom, the buddy comedy, the school setting, the outsider main character. They borrow from the same set of visual traditions: the flat-shaded character design, the simplified background style, the mixed media collage. They borrow from the same set of comedic registers: the running gag, the breaking of the fourth wall, the sudden visual style change for one joke before returning to the main style. None of these elements were invented by Gumball. Most of them existed for decades before Gumball existed. What Gumball did was reassemble them into a configuration that nobody else had quite achieved. And that configuration was so distinctive that, for a few years afterwards, almost any new cartoon that used any of the same individual elements was going to be accused of having ripped off the configuration that Gumball had made famous. That is the kind of accusation that gets made against the next show on our list. Even though, when you watch the show with any kind of attention, the comparison breaks down pretty quickly. Sanjay and Craig was a Nickelodeon show that ran for 3 seasons starting in 2013, and it is one of the more interesting cases on this list, because the show has both the strongest argument for being a Gumball comparison and the strongest argument against. It is the kind of show that rewards careful analysis precisely because both sides of the debate are defensible, and both sides of the debate are partially wrong. The premise of Sanjay and Craig is that a boy called Sanjay lives with his family in a small town, and his best friend is a talking snake called Craig. The snake can pass for a normal snake when other people are looking, but when alone with Sanjay, can talk and is fully sentient. Most episodes follow the two of them as they get into some kind of strange, often gross, often very loud adventure. The show has a particular interest in toilet humor, and in bodily fluids, and in the kinds of jokes that make 10-year-olds laugh and their parents wince. It is, in many ways, a much more aggressively juvenile show than Gumball. Gumball will go to crude places, but it always seems to do so with a kind of formal grace. Sanjay and Craig goes to crude places with no grace at all, and quite often with celebratory enthusiasm. The Gumball comparison in this case rests partly on a structural element and partly on a visual one. Structurally, the show is built around a friendship between two characters who are not really brothers, but might as well be, which echoes the Gumball and Darwin dynamic at a high level. Visually, the show occasionally drops live-action photographs into its frames as gags, much as Gumball does, and the color palette of its main characters has the same kind of bright, saturated, almost neon quality that Gumball plays with when its color key is leaning into its loudest mode. But the comparison stops working pretty quickly once you sit with the show for any length of time. Sanjay and Craig is not, in any meaningful sense, a mixed media show. The vast majority of its visual world is drawn animation in a style that owes much more to a tradition of high-energy American cartoons, with influences ranging from late 90s Nicktoons to the broader Adult Swim aesthetic of the early 2010s. The mixed media moments, when they happen, are clearly used as punctuation, not as the foundation of the show's visual language. Gumball is mixed media at its core. Sanjay and Craig is drawn animation that occasionally winks at mixed media. Those are very different propositions. What is genuinely interesting about Sanjay and Craig, and what gets lost in the ripoff framing, is that the show was a fairly historically significant piece of Nickelodeon programming for reasons that have nothing to do with Gumball at all. It was, when it premiered, one of the very few American animated television shows headlined by an Indian-American main character, and the show drew its name, in part, from the personal background of the people who developed it. There is a real argument to be made that Sanjay and Craig deserves to be talked about as a small but meaningful step in the broader history of representation in American children's animation, and that conversation is almost completely drowned out by the unrelated conversation about whether or not it was a Gumball ripoff. The two conversations have nothing to do with each other, but the second conversation is the one the internet has decided to have, and so the first one tends to get sidelined. The show ran for 3 seasons before ending in 2016, and it has not exactly enjoyed a critical reassessment in the years since. The general consensus is still that it was a loud, crude, fairly forgettable show that overshot its juvenile target sometimes and missed it other times. But the specific charge that it was somehow stealing from Gumball does not really hold up the second you put the two shows in the same window and watch a few minutes of each. They are doing different things. They are aimed at slightly different audiences. They share some surface elements, because the surface elements of children's animation in the mid-2010s were genuinely shared across the entire industry. To call Sanjay and Craig a Gumball ripoff is to mistake a shared cultural language for a stolen one. It is the kind of accusation that, in retrospect, feels more like a reflex than an argument. If Sanjay and Craig is the show where the comparison is debatable, the next show on our list is the one where the comparison gets, in some ways, even harder to pin down. because the comparison itself is mostly about a feeling. Breadwinners premiered on Nickelodeon in 2014 and lasted for 2 seasons before being quietly retired. It is a show about 2 ducks, called Sway Sway and Badoose, who deliver bread out of a rocket van, and that sentence is the entire premise. There is no deeper hook than that. The show is built almost entirely out of high-energy slapstick, intentionally crude humor, and a visual style that combines hand-drawn ducks with bright photographic backgrounds, occasional bits of stock imagery, and a kind of loud, unrelenting design philosophy that seems to want the viewer to look at any given frame for as little time as possible. The Gumball comparison, in this case, is once again partly about the mixed media gestures and partly about the broader sense that the show is reaching for a kind of internet absurdism that Gumball had already legitimized. The ducks live in a world that is sometimes drawn and sometimes photographed, with food in particular often being represented by photographs of real bread, real cheese, real pizza, dropped onto the frame in a way that, if you were not paying attention, you could easily mistake for the kind of food photography Gumball uses to comic effect throughout its run. The visual joke is structurally the same. A drawn character holds up an obviously photographed object. The contrast between the 2 visual registers is meant to generate the humor. Gumball does this constantly. Breadwinners did it whenever it could. But the comparison, again, breaks down once you look at the actual texture of the show. Breadwinners is, fundamentally, a SpongeBob descendant. Its energy, its character design, its sense of comedic timing, its tolerance for grossness, all of it comes directly from a tradition of Nickelodeon animation that goes back to the late 90s. The ducks are not really copies of Gumball and Darwin. They are copies, or at least cousins, of any number of high-energy Nickelodeon double acts that the network had been producing for 2 decades. The show was widely criticized when it came out, not really for being a Gumball ripoff in any deep sense, but for being a particularly aggressive example of Nickelodeon leaning into a kind of crude, loud, hyperactive comedy that a lot of viewers and critics felt was crowding out more thoughtful work on the network. The Gumball comparison was almost an afterthought. It was layered onto an existing complaint about Nickelodeon's broader programming direction, and Breadwinners became one of the easiest shorthand examples in that broader complaint. What Breadwinners genuinely does have in common with Pickle and Peanut, and what places both shows in the same family on our list, is the suspicion that the creative leadership knew exactly what they were doing when they reached for the photographed food gags. By 2014, the visual trick of pasting a photograph into an animated frame had become a kind of industry signal. It said, "Look, we are also doing the thing that the cool, surreal, beloved cartoon over on Cartoon Network is doing." The trick was almost a piece of branding. It was a way for a different network's show to telegraph to children, especially to children watching with their parents, that the show they were watching was operating in the same broad cultural neighborhood as Gumball, even if the show itself had no other meaningful overlap. That telegraphing is, in the end, what makes the ripoff accusations stick to shows like Breadwinners, even when the deeper structural comparison does not really hold. The shows borrowed a signal that Gumball had popularized. They used that signal to claim cultural territory that they had not earned. And audiences, especially online audiences who knew Gumball well, recognized the borrowing and resented it. It is also worth saying, because we are trying to be honest throughout, that Breadwinners has, in the years since it ended, found a kind of quiet, ironic appreciation among certain corners of the internet. There are people who have grown up to find the show funnier than they did at the time. There are even, somewhere out in the long tail of cartoon fandom, sincere defenders of the show who argue that it was misjudged in its moment and that its commitment to its own loud, simple aesthetic is, in retrospect, more interesting than the critical reception of the time allowed. We are not here to relitigate the merits of Breadwinners. We are here to note that, as far as the Gumball ripoff conversation is concerned, the show occupies a real but somewhat marginal position. It is, at most, a cousin. It is not, in any deep sense, a copy. The next show on the list is one of the more sympathetic entries, and one of the ones that comes closest to being a genuinely good show on its own terms, regardless of the Gumball comparisons. Harvey Beaks ran on Nickelodeon from 2015 until 2017, across 2 seasons. It was created by C.A. Greenblatt, who is one of the more respected hands in modern American animation, having worked across a number of beloved shows before he ever got around to creating his own. Harvey Beaks is not a mixed media show. It does not pretend to be. Its visual language is gentle, hand-drawn, soft in color, deliberately less aggressive than most of the cartoons that share its broader era. And yet, Harvey Beaks ends up on Gumball ripoff lists with some regularity, and it is worth taking the time to figure out why. The show follows a small bird boy called Harvey Beaks, who is, by nature, a polite and rule-following child, and who befriends two wilder, more chaotic forest creatures called Fee and Foo. The three of them have small, gentle, often emotional adventures in a forest community that is full of slightly absurd talking animals. The show has a quiet, melancholy streak underneath its comedy, and it is willing to spend time on the kinds of small emotional beats that other cartoons would skip over to get to the next joke. In tone, in pace, in willingness to let a scene breathe, Harvey Beaks is, in fact, one of the closest Nickelodeon ever got to capturing the actual spirit of Gumball, as opposed to its surface. That is the real comparison, and that is why the comparison gets made. Harvey Beaks does not look like Gumball. It does not borrow any of the photographic tricks. It does not lean into mixed media. Its character designs are entirely its own. And yet, when you watch a Harvey Beaks episode that lets a moment of friendship sit, or that pauses on a small piece of childhood embarrassment, or that lets one of its characters be quietly and honestly sad for a beat before the show goes back to its comedy, you can feel the influence of the broader animation moment that Gumball helped to shape. A whole generation of cartoon creators, especially those working in the mid-2010s, were watching Gumball and absorbing its tonal lessons. The lesson was that you could be funny and tender on the same line. The lesson was that the family or the friend group, treated with real care, could carry comedy that would not work without that care. The lesson was that you did not need to choose between the joke and the heart, because the heart could be the joke, and the joke could be the heart. Harvey Beaks learned those lessons better than almost any other show on this list. That is not a sign that it ripped off Gumball. It is, if anything, a sign of respect. The show is operating in a shared emotional register that Gumball helped to make legitimate on a children's network, and Harvey Beaks is putting its own characters and its own world into that register without copying anything specific. That is exactly what influence is supposed to look like, as opposed to theft. And the fact that Harvey Beaks tends to get included in ripoff lists anyway is a sign of how broken the discourse around this can get. The accusation is so loose by the late 2010s that it can be applied to any show that even remotely tries to do what Gumball was doing emotionally, even shows that visually share none of Gumball's surface signatures. What happened to Harvey Beaks is also worth flagging, because it fits into a pattern that runs through this whole list. The show was not a ratings hit. It did not get the marketing push that some of its more aggressive contemporaries got. It was treated, by Nickelodeon, as a small and gentle programming choice, and it was eventually retired without much fanfare. There is no real controversy in its history. It just ended quietly, the way shows that are working at a quieter emotional register often do. The result is that, if you go looking for Harvey Beaks now, you will find a small and committed group of viewers who remember it fondly, and a much larger group of viewers who have only ever heard of it in the context of being compared to Gumball, often unfavorably and often unfairly. The comparison does the show a disservice. Harvey Beaks deserves to be talked about for what it actually did, which was to put real, careful, thoughtful animation about childhood friendship on a major children's network at a moment when most of the network's other shows were going louder and faster every year. It is not a Gumball ripoff. It is, in some sense, a quiet acknowledgement that Gumball had won the argument about how children's animation could be written, and that the rest of the industry was, finally, starting to listen. The next show on the list is the one that gets the most complicated entry, because it is, by lineage and by personnel, the closest of any of these shows to Gumball itself. Apple and Onion premiered on Cartoon Network in 2018, and it was created by George Gendy, who had previously worked on Gumball as a storyboard artist. The show was made at the same European studio that made Gumball, by people who had worked on Gumball, in many cases at desks that were physically close to the desks where Gumball was made. If you wanted to point to a show and say, this one really has the right to inherit Gumball's visual language, this is the show. And yet, Apple and Onion is, in the broader online conversation, frequently described as a Gumball ripoff. The argument, when people make it, tends to focus on the photographed backgrounds, on the mixed media visual approach, on the way that the show layers flat two-dimensional characters over a town that is built out of photographs in exactly the way that Elmore is built out of photographs. The visual continuity between the two shows is undeniable. Apple and Onion is, in a literal sense, made in the same visual tradition as Gumball, and the studio behind it does not particularly try to hide that. The choice is, in some ways, a kind of brand consolidation. The studio had become known for a particular kind of mixed media look, and Apple and Onion was, in part, an attempt to extend that look across a different property. What the show tries to do that is genuinely different is in its tone and its subject matter. Apple and Onion is set in a city of anthropomorphic food, and its main characters, an apple and an onion, are roommates trying to make their way through young adult life. The show is, in a real way, more of a young adult sitcom than a children's sitcom. Its humor is gentler, its pace is slower. Its concerns are more about social anxiety, about friendship in early adulthood, about the small humiliations of trying to be likable in a city full of strangers, than about the kinds of school and family situations that drive Gumball. The show is, in a serious way, an attempt to use the visual language of Gumball to talk about something that Gumball was not particularly interested in talking about. The fact that Apple and Onion ends up on Gumball ripoff lists is in some sense a kind of compliment that the audience does not realize it is paying. The audience is, in effect, saying, "This show looks too much like Gumball to be allowed to do something different." The audience wants the visual language to be exclusive to the original show, and the studio's decision to share that language across multiple shows in its slate is, intentionally or not, a kind of provocation. It is the studio saying, "This look is bigger than one show. This look can be used for other stories. The look belongs to us, the studio, not to one specific cartoon." That is, of course, a defensible creative position. It is also a position that audiences tend to reject, because audiences feel that style is something a particular show earned, not something a studio can simply transfer to whichever project comes next. The blowback against Apple and Onion, to the extent that there was blowback, came not from any specific theft. It came from the broader sense that the studio had built a signature look on the back of Gumball and was now redeploying that look in a way that, however creatively defensible, did not feel quite right to viewers who had grown up associating it exclusively with one family in one town. Apple and Onion ran for 2 seasons and ended at a moderate length, with a quietly loyal audience and a critical reception that, while not as celebratory as Gumball's, was largely respectful. It is one of the better cases on this list, because the people who made it had a genuine creative reason for using the visual approach they used, and because the show itself, when you watch it, has a personality of its own that is not borrowed from Gumball. But the ripoff accusation persists, because the visual signature is so distinctive, and because the broader audience has not yet adapted to the idea that the signature might belong to a studio rather than to a single show. That argument is, in some ways, still being worked out in real time. The Loud House is one of the stranger inclusions on the Gumball ripoff list, and one of the cases where the inclusion seems to rest almost entirely on a misreading of the genre, rather than on any direct visual comparison. The Loud House premiered on Nickelodeon in 2016, and it follows an only son in a family of 10 daughters as he tries to navigate the chaos of a household that has more siblings than most cartoons have ever attempted to keep track of. The show is drawn in a clean, simplified, somewhat newspaper comic strip influenced style. It does not use mixed media in any sustained way. Its backgrounds are drawn rather than photographed. Its character designs are deliberately uniform across the cast, the way comic strip family designs often are, with the main visual distinction between the sisters being color, hairstyle, and outfit, rather than radically different species or body types. In other words, on every measurable visual surface, The Loud House is a different kind of cartoon to Gumball. It has a different style, it has a different scope, it has a different rhythm, and yet, in the broader Gumball ripoff conversation, The Loud House sometimes gets pulled in, usually under the argument that any new animated family sitcom on a rival network is, almost by definition, an attempt to compete with Gumball for the same demographic. That argument, taken seriously, would mean that almost every animated family sitcom of the last 20 years is, in some sense, a Gumball ripoff, which is obviously absurd. The animated family sitcom is one of the oldest formats in television. The Loud House is no more a ripoff of Gumball than The Simpsons is a ripoff of the Flintstones, which is to say, only in the most generic genre sense. There are real conversations to be had about what The Loud House does well and where it falls short. But the Gumball comparison is, in this case, doing none of the useful work. It is a category error, of the same kind we saw earlier with Bunsen. The Loud House is a Nickelodeon show that, in the most general sense, is trying to do family comedy. Gumball is also, in the most general sense, doing family comedy. That is the entirety of the overlap, and it is not enough to base an accusation on. There is, however, a version of the Loud House conversation that is more interesting than the Ripoff version, and it is worth touching on briefly before we leave the show behind. The Loud House was, in its early seasons, treated as a kind of test case for what mainstream American children's animation could look like in the late 2010s, in the same way that Gumball had been treated as a test case in the early 2010s. The two shows are, in a sense, bookends of the same general moment in children's television history. Gumball opens the moment by demonstrating that ambitious, careful, weirdly designed animation can hold an audience. The Loud House closes the moment by demonstrating that the audience the new approach has built up will follow a more traditionally styled family sitcom as long as the writing keeps up. The two shows are not competitors and not copies of each other. They are, if anything, complementary entries in the larger story of how the animated family sitcom evolved during a particularly creative decade of children's television. We have, up to this point, been talking mostly about the major studios, the big four American networks and their satellites, with the brief Canadian detour, and the various ways in which their programming during the early to mid-2010s was either accused of or actually involved in copying Gumball at some level of intention. But this is, in a real way, only the first half of the conversation. The most extreme cases of Gumball influence and Gumball imitation do not come from the major networks. They come from international markets, especially from animation studios in countries where the broader copyright environment is looser, where production budgets are smaller, and where the path to making a children's show that sells to local broadcasters often involves looking very carefully at what is succeeding internationally and then making something that resembles it. The international ripoff conversation is one of the more uncomfortable areas of this whole topic, because it is easy, when you are not careful, to drift into a kind of unflattering tone about animation industries in other countries. That is not what this is. The international animation industry, taken as a whole, includes some of the most creative work being made anywhere in the world. The Japanese industry, the French industry, the Korean industry, the Spanish industry, the Irish industry, all of these have track records that any country would be proud of. The shows we are going to talk about in this section are not representative of those industries as wholes. They are, in many cases, the work of small studios in countries where the cartoon market has a different shape from the American market, where the work is often subcontracted, where the production calendar is short, and where the network buyer is looking for cheap content to fill a slot rather than for a flagship original. Those conditions produce a particular kind of show and a particular kind of imitation. It is worth understanding them on their own terms. The most widely discussed international Gumball imitation is a Chinese cartoon that, for a number of years now, has been the subject of side-by-side comparison videos all over YouTube. The show, by various accounts, features a family of brightly colored animal characters living in a town environment, with backgrounds and props drawn in a style that closely resembles the Gumball approach, and with character designs that, in several cases, look like they were modeled on specific Gumball cast members with small alterations. The show has been pulled from various platforms at various times, and the discourse around it has been extensive enough that, even if you have never sought out international animation, you have probably scrolled past a side-by-side at some point. The show exists. It is documented. The comparison is real. The comparison is, in the most direct cases, almost shot for shot. This is, by most accounts, the same broad phenomenon that the Copycats episode of Gumball itself was reaching out to acknowledge, with its in-show Chi-Chi family standing in for the wave of overseas knockoffs that the writers had clearly been watching go viral online. Before we go further on this, it is worth being precise. The fact that a Chinese cartoon has clearly drawn heavy inspiration from Gumball does not by itself mean anything sinister about Chinese animation broadly. The Chinese animation industry produces a huge volume of work, much of which is original and ambitious and successful on its own terms. There is also a track record, well documented across the past 2 decades, of certain individual studios in the broader Chinese market producing shows that lift, sometimes with very little modification, from American or Japanese hits. This has happened to a number of Western properties besides Gumball. It is, in some sense, a structural feature of how the cheaper end of the children's animation market operates in any country, where the legal and reputational consequences of close imitation are not high enough to discourage the practice. Gumball happens to be one of the more visually distinctive shows of its era, which makes the imitation easier to recognize. That visibility, in turn, makes the comparison videos easier to make, which means the imitation is talked about more, even though it is not necessarily worse than imitation that targets shows with less distinctive looks. What is genuinely interesting about the Chinese Gumball case is what it reveals about the limits of style. The imitating show, in the worst-case examples, copies the surface features of Gumball almost perfectly. It uses photographed backgrounds. It uses flat character designs over those backgrounds. It uses a family configuration that mirrors the Watterson family at a structural level. It even, in some cases, uses color palettes and proportions that recall the original cast directly. And yet, when you actually watch the show, even with no understanding of the language, you can feel within seconds that you are not watching Gumball. The thing that is missing is not visible. It is rhythm. It is timing. It is the particular way that Gumball's writers know exactly how long to let a joke breathe before they cut away. It is the way the show knows when to be loud and when to whisper. It is the way the show writes its characters not as bodies that walk around delivering lines, but as people whose interior lives are constantly visible through small choices in their performance. The imitator can copy the look. The imitator cannot copy the writing. And the writing, as we said at the start of this whole essay, is the actual show. The mixed media surface is a costume. The international ripoffs, the most aggressive of them, make this point with brutal clarity. They lift the costume entirely, and the body inside the costume is not there. The result is a show that, frame by frame, looks almost identical to Gumball, but that, scene by scene, is unmistakably hollow. You can copy a designer's sketch. You cannot copy the years of craft that went into knowing which sketch to make and how to make it land. There have also been, across a range of international markets, smaller and more obscure cases of Gumball imitation that do not get the same level of attention. There have been cheap mobile animations made for short-form video platforms that lift designs wholesale. There have been small studio shorts uploaded to various international YouTube equivalents, often aimed at very young children, that use clearly traced or near-traced Watterson family members in different contexts. Many of these are taken down quickly by copyright claims when they are noticed. Many of them are not noticed at all, because they exist in language and platform ecosystems that the broader Gumball fandom does not regularly browse. Their existence is, in some ways, the inevitable shadow side of a very successful piece of intellectual property. Any cartoon that becomes recognizable to a global audience will, sooner or later, find itself being imitated by smaller and more anonymous players, and the chase between rights holders and imitators is, in animation as in everywhere else, mostly a losing battle for the rights holders, because the imitators are faster and cheaper and more numerous than the legal system that is supposed to police them. There is another category of international imitation that is worth flagging, even though it is harder to talk about responsibly, which is the practice of certain low-budget studios pumping out short videos that use clearly Gumball-influenced designs as part of a broader content farming operation aimed at children's YouTube traffic. This is a phenomenon that has been documented by journalists and by the platform companies themselves at various points over the last decade. The pattern is that a small studio will set up multiple channels, each of which posts dozens of short videos a week, all of them using cartoon characters that are either traced from existing intellectual property or designed to be just close enough to existing intellectual property to capture search traffic without immediately triggering takedown. The Wattersons, because of their visual distinctiveness, have been targets of this kind of activity, although they are far from the only ones. The Watterson knockoffs, when they appear in this context, are usually placed into stories that have nothing to do with Gumball at all, often featuring grotesque or simply bizarre plot beats. And the result, for any viewer who stumbles across these videos, is a deeply uncanny sense that you are watching characters you almost recognize doing things they would never do. The discourse around children's YouTube content of this kind has been complicated and ongoing, and we are not going to go deep into it tonight, because it leads away from the main subject of this essay. But it is worth knowing that the Gumball brand has, like many other major children's properties, had a long and unhappy life as a target for this kind of imitation. The Indian case is one of the more frequently discussed in the broader Gumball ripoff conversation, although it is also one of the cases where the conversation tends to flatten a lot of nuance. There have been Indian animations and animated shorts that draw heavily on Gumball, both in character design and in tone, and these have been the subject of comparison videos. The Indian animation industry as a whole is, of course, vastly larger and vastly more sophisticated than any of these individual cases would suggest. It is the same situation as with the Chinese examples. The existence of specific imitating shows in a national market is not an indictment of the market as a whole. It is a reflection of how some specific producers, in some specific market conditions, decided to operate. What unites all of the international cases, the Chinese case, the Indian case, the smaller European and South American and Eastern European cases, is the recognition that Gumball, more than almost any other Western children's cartoon of its era, was an unusually visible target. There are several reasons for this. The first is the show's visual distinctiveness. It is easy to copy and easy to recognize. The second is its global reach. Cartoon Network is one of the few children's networks that can be said to have genuine worldwide brand recognition, and Gumball, as one of its flagship shows of the 2010s, was distributed widely. The third is the show's character roster, which features a large supporting cast of very different visual designs that can be borrowed individually without needing to copy the whole family at once. The fourth, and arguably the most important, is the show's long run. Gumball was on the air for nearly a decade. That is a long time for any imitating studio to study the show, to absorb its lessons, and to deploy copies of those lessons in markets where the original may not even be broadcasting. The combination of distinctiveness, reach, modularity, and longevity made Gumball one of the most copied cartoons of its era, possibly anywhere in the world. The fact that the copying is so visible is, in some ways, just a measure of how successfully Gumball achieved exactly the cultural penetration that any cartoon hopes to achieve. There is a related conversation to be had here, although it is a tangent we should not dwell on too long, about the way that some international markets have, in recent years, produced animation that is much closer to genuine homage than to ripoff. There are shows being made in studios outside the United States and outside the United Kingdom that have clearly absorbed lessons from Gumball, that have studied its tonal vocabulary, its pacing, its blend of comedy and quiet emotion, and that have used those lessons to make wholly original shows of their own. These shows do not look like Gumball. They do not borrow its visual language. They do not copy its characters. What they do is take the deeper craft lessons that Gumball offered and apply those lessons to whatever local subject matter and whatever local visual tradition they happen to be working in. This is what cultural exchange in animation is supposed to look like. The visible ripoffs, the comparison video material, the shot-for-shot copies, are the noisy end of the spectrum. The quieter end of the spectrum is full of much more interesting work that owes Gumball something but does not pretend the debt does not exist, and work that has added more to the world than it has taken from it. We have, by this point, been talking for a while about specific shows and specific kinds of imitation, and it is worth zooming out for a moment to ask a more abstract question that has been hovering over this entire essay, which is the question of whether style itself is something that can be owned. Because the entire ripoff conversation, in animation and elsewhere, ultimately hinges on this. If style can be owned, then a show that borrows another show's style without permission is doing something genuinely wrong. If style cannot be owned, then everything we have been calling a ripoff is, at most, an unflattering homage, and the legal and moral framework for treating it as theft falls apart pretty quickly. The honest answer is that style ownership, in animation as in most creative fields, is real in a kind of social sense and almost entirely unreal in a legal sense. The law, in most countries, is generally not prepared to grant ownership over a visual style as such. especially when that style is built out of combinations of techniques that are themselves widely available. The use of photographed backgrounds, the use of flat character designs, the use of mixed media collage. None of these are things that any one show can claim to own. The specific characters of Gumball are protected. The specific designs of the Watterson family are protected. The specific scripts and storyboards and shot sequences of any given episode are protected. But the broader visual language of which Gumball is the most famous user is not, and cannot be, anybody's exclusive property. What does exist, though, in the social sense, is a kind of widely understood norm about who originated what and who is borrowing from whom. The animation community knows, on the whole, that Gumball was the show that brought mixed media into the children's animation mainstream of the 2010s. It knows that any subsequent show using a similar approach is operating in territory that Gumball mapped out. And it knows, in the way that any creative community knows these things, that there are graceful and ungraceful ways to operate in territory that somebody else mapped out. The graceful way is to acknowledge the debt, to add something of your own, to push the language somewhere it has not been before. The ungraceful way is to borrow without adding, to imitate without acknowledging, and to compete for the same audience attention with a worse version of the same thing. The shows on this list, taken as a whole, span the full range of this spectrum. Some of them are graceful. Apple and Onion, in its own way, is graceful, because the people making it had a real connection to Gumball and a real intention to do something different with the shared visual language. Harvey Beaks is graceful, because it borrows from Gumball's emotional vocabulary while making something entirely its own visually. Other shows on this list are less graceful. Pickle and Peanut is not, in any meaningful sense, adding to the visual language it has borrowed. It is using the language to fill a slot. Breadwinners is similar. And the international ripoffs, the most aggressive of them, are the entirely ungraceful end of the spectrum, where the borrowing is total and the addition is zero. The point of all this is not to issue verdicts. The point is to recognize that ripoff is, in practice, less of a legal concept and more of a social one. Audiences feel ripoffs when they encounter them, even when they could not articulate the legal basis for the feeling. The feeling is real and it is meaningful, but it is not the same as theft in any strict sense. It is, more accurately, a kind of breach of an unspoken contract between a creative community and its imitators. The original show invents something. The imitators are allowed to borrow that something, but they are expected to give something back in the form of new ideas, new applications, new directions. When the imitators borrow without giving back, the audience reacts. And that reaction, accumulated over a decade across dozens of shows and YouTube essays and forum threads, is what we are really documenting tonight. There is, before we move on, an uncomfortable question that we have been dancing around for a while, and that is whether Gumball itself, the show whose imitators we have been cataloging, is, in some sense, a ripoff of something else. Because no creative work emerges from nothing. Every show is downstream of other shows. Gumball had its influences. Gumball borrowed. Gumball, in some senses, is itself a kind of remix of older visual and comedic traditions. The fairness of this entire conversation depends, in part, on being willing to ask the question in both directions. The most obvious place to start is with the broader tradition of mixed media animation, which had been alive in various forms for decades before Gumball arrived. The use of photographed elements in animated frames goes back nearly to the beginning of cinema, with early experimental shorts using cut paper, photographs, and live-action overlay in various combinations. The use of photographed backgrounds specifically, in a children's animation context, was being done in various ways by various studios before Gumball, including by music video directors, by experimental shorts makers, and by some preschool animation. Gumball did not invent any of this. What Gumball did was take elements that had been used here and there in different contexts and assemble them into a coherent narrative television show that could be sustained across a long run. That assembly is a creative act in itself, even though the individual pieces were borrowed. Beyond mixed media, Gumball has clear stylistic ancestors in a number of other places. The show's tone, which combines absurdist comedy with genuine emotional sincerity, draws on a tradition of British family comedy that runs back through several decades of live-action sitcoms, as well as through specific animated influences. The show's family configuration, with 2 parents, 2 boys, and a younger sister, echoes the configurations of many earlier animated families, going back to the early eras of American primetime animation. The way the show stages its school sequences, with a wide and weird cast of classmates each given a single defining trait, is a structure that has been used in countless cartoons before, going back at least to the broader Looney Tunes tradition of treating supporting characters as walking premises. In other words, Gumball is, in the most literal sense, a remix. It is a recombination of elements that were already available to anyone who knew enough about the history of animation to know where to look. What makes the recombination feel original is the quality of the assembly, not the originality of the individual parts. And this is, in fact, true of almost every cartoon you can name. The Simpsons was, at the time of its premiere, accused of being a ripoff of older animated families. SpongeBob was, at its premiere, accused of borrowing from older underwater cartoons. Every successful show is, in its moment, accused of being insufficiently original by somebody. The accusation is, in some sense, the price of being recognizable enough to be compared to something. So if Gumball itself is, in this sense, a remix, then the line between Gumball and the shows accused of ripping it off becomes less of a clean wall and more of a continuum. Some of the imitators are, in fact, doing exactly what Gumball did, which is to assemble pre-existing elements into a new configuration. Some of them are doing it well, and some of them are doing it badly. The ones doing it badly are the ones who get accused most loudly of being rip-offs. The ones doing it well are usually not accused at all, because their assembly is original enough to disguise the borrowing. This is, I think, the honest reckoning the rip-off conversation has to come to eventually. There is no clean distinction between borrowing and stealing in animation, because the entire medium is built out of borrowed elements. The distinction we are actually making, when we use the word rip-off, is between borrowing that produces something worth watching and borrowing that does not. The shows on this list are accused of being rip-offs, primarily because they are not very good. If they were good, the same borrowings would be called influences. If Gumball were not as good as it is, the same elements that make it feel original would be called rip-offs. The label tracks the quality of the result more closely than it tracks the actual mechanics of the borrowing. That brings us, by a long route, to a related set of cartoons that often come up in these conversations, even though their relationship to Gumball is much more complicated than the ones we have been discussing. The most interesting of these is Uncle Grandpa, which ran on Cartoon Network from 2013 until 2017. Uncle Grandpa, as a show, is so visually committed to its own particular brand of surrealism that the comparison to Gumball is, in some ways, a category error. The show is about a character who is everyone's uncle and everyone's grandpa at the same time, and who travels the country in a magical RV with a sentient tiger rug and a piece of pizza that talks. The show is, by design, an exercise in visual maximalism, and it uses mixed media frequently, often in much more extreme ways than Gumball does, including sustained live-action sequences and full episode visual style changes. The thing about Uncle Grandpa is that it was made on the same network as Gumball, and so the conversation about whether it is a ripoff has a different shape from the conversation about, for example, Pickle and Peanut. You cannot really call a Cartoon Network show a ripoff of another Cartoon Network show in the same way, because they are not competing for the same audience attention from rival networks. They are sitting on the same shelf, in the same store, sold by the same merchant. The comparisons that come up between Uncle Grandpa and Gumball tend to be more about specific gags, about the use of certain photographic effects, about overlap in certain extras and voice talent, rather than about any wholesale theft. The two shows are, in some senses, siblings rather than competitors. They were developed in roughly the same era, at roughly the same network, with some overlap in creative personnel, and they both ended up being places where a particular kind of visually playful, formally inventive cartoon comedy could exist. That said, the relationship between Uncle Grandpa and Gumball is, in some ways, instructive about a deeper question, which is how Cartoon Network as an institution viewed the visual language that Gumball had popularized. Uncle Grandpa, in some episodes, leans into mixed media in a way that feels like a deliberate extension of the toolkit that Gumball had been using, as if the network were experimenting with how far the toolkit could be pushed in a different kind of show. Some of those experiments worked. some of them did not. But the broader gesture is one of a studio system trying to develop a house style across multiple programs, in a way that is not really different from how live-action sitcoms or dramas often share an aesthetic across a single network. It is just more visible in animation, because the visual choices are more legible and more distinctive. Clarence is another Cartoon Network show that sometimes comes up in adjacent conversations, although Clarence is, in most respects, a different kind of project entirely. It ran from 2014 to 2018, and it followed a relentlessly cheerful boy and his two best friends through a small-town childhood. It is, by visual design, a clean, soft, hand-drawn cartoon with no mixed media to speak of. Its tonal lineage runs through a tradition of slice-of-life children's cartoons rather than through the surrealism that Gumball traffics in. To call Clarence a Gumball ripoff would be one of the most strained comparisons on this entire list. But Clarence does come up sometimes, usually in the context of broader conversations about Cartoon Network's lineup in the mid-2010s, and it is worth flagging because it represents the opposite end of the spectrum from the shows we have been mostly talking about. Clarence is what a network looks like when it is making shows that are not in conversation with Gumball at all, while still operating in the same era. Its presence on the schedule was, in some sense, a reminder that not every show on Cartoon Network was trying to do the Gumball thing, and that the network's identity was broader than any single visual approach. Regular Show is, occasionally, also dragged into this conversation, although the comparison there is so strained that it is hard to take seriously. Regular Show, which ran on Cartoon Network from 2010 until 2017, predates Gumball, technically, by less than a year. Its visual style is unrelated to Gumball's. Its tonal register is different. The two shows happen to coexist on the same network for most of their respective runs, and they share, at a high level, an interest in low-key but absurdist comedy. But the resemblance ends there. Anyone who calls Regular Show a Gumball ripoff is doing so primarily on the basis that both shows are animated and both are aimed at older children. The accusation, in that case, is meaningless. It is an example of how loose the ripoff label can get when applied uncritically. One of the more obscure inclusions on the broader Gumball ripoff iceberg is a category of mid-2010s children's animations that aired primarily in the United Kingdom and Europe, often on satellite or streaming channels, and that drew clear inspiration from Gumball without ever really pretending otherwise. These shows are, on the whole, less well known to American audiences, which means they show up in side-by-side comparisons less often. But they exist, and they are part of the longer tale of Gumball's influence. Some of them are made by small independent studios. Some of them are commissioned by satellite networks that need to fill broadcast slots cheaply. Most of them never reached anything like the audience or the longevity of the major American examples we have been discussing. What is interesting about these smaller European examples, taken together, is that they reveal something about how Gumball, as a kind of branded look, has been absorbed into the broader vocabulary of European children's television. Mixed media, photographed backgrounds, flat characters over photographic spaces, suburban setting, genuinely strange supporting cast. These features, taken individually, are no longer specifically Gumball features. They have become available choices that any small studio in any part of the European children's animation market can pick up and use, without anyone particularly noticing the borrowing, because the borrowing has become routine. The Gumball look has, in some sense, dissolved into the general background of the industry, in a way that very few specific show looks ever achieve. That dissolution is, paradoxically, both a kind of cultural victory for the show and the reason why so many of its smaller imitators escape the kind of accusation that the larger imitators attract. There is also a category of accidental near ripoffs that occur in advertising and short-form content, where production studios producing commercials for various brands have, at various points, used a Gumball-influenced visual style without any obvious connection to the show itself. These tend to be commercials for products aimed at children, where the agency or the studio has chosen a visual look that looks vaguely like Gumball as a way of signaling to the target audience that the product is fun and contemporary. These accidental ripoffs do not usually attract much attention because they are short and because the audiences for advertising are different from the audiences for sustained children's television. But they exist, and they are part of the broader pattern. Once a visual style becomes recognizable, every part of the surrounding media ecosystem will, sooner or later, find some use for that style. Some of that use will be done thoughtfully, and some of it will not. We have, by this point, walked through most of the famous accused offenders, and a number of the less famous ones, and the smaller categories of international and advertising and adjacent media. There is one more category that we should touch on before we start moving towards the broader conclusions of the essay, and that is the category of shows that were never made, but that were pitched, and that might have ended up on this list if they had ever been put into production. The animation industry pitch system is largely invisible to the general public. Networks receive enormous numbers of pitches every year, most of which are rejected, and the shape of those pitches says a lot about what creative people think the network is currently looking for. During the years when Gumball was at its commercial peak, a significant number of pitches sent to children's networks, particularly to Cartoon Network's competitors, drew clear inspiration from Gumball, in tone, in design, in family configuration, in visual approach. The vast majority of those pitches were never made. They sit in development files at various companies, undocumented, unfilmed, sometimes briefly drafted as pilot scripts and storyboards and then abandoned. Some of these unmade pitches have, over the years, been discussed in industry interviews, on creator commentary tracks, in retrospective articles about specific networks. The pattern is consistent across all of them. There was, for several years, a clear and recurring instinct among American children's network executives to ask for the next Gumball. The phrase "the next Gumball" became, in some of those development conversations, a kind of shorthand for a show that has the mixed media look, the absurdist humor, the family center, and the offbeat sensibility, in a different specific configuration. Most of the pitches that came back to this brief did not get made. Some of them got made and ended up on this list. The ones that got made and failed are, in some sense, evidence of how hard the original Gumball brief actually was, and how rare a show that achieves what Gumball achieves really is. It is not enough to have the brief. The brief was the easy part. The execution was the hard part, and the hard part is what the failures all share. They had the brief, they did not have the execution. This is also probably the right moment to talk about what the people who made Gumball did after Gumball ended, because the broader question of what happens to the talent on a successful long-running show is, in some ways, central to the Ripoff conversation. When a show like Gumball reaches the end of its run, the people who worked on it, the storyboard artists, the directors, the writers, the designers, the color stylists, the background painters, they do not vanish. They go on to other projects. Some of them stay at the studio. Some of them move to other studios. Some of them start their own projects. Some of them leave the industry entirely. The diaspora of a successful animated show is, in some sense, where the future of the medium gets shaped, because the lessons learned on the show travel with the people, and those lessons start showing up, sometimes in disguised forms, in the next decade of cartoons. The Gumball Alumni Network, when you trace it, is large. The show ran for nearly a decade, employed hundreds of people across its production, and reached into multiple national animation industries. Some of those people have, in the years since the show ended, gone on to make their own animated work. Some of that work has been quietly successful. Some of it has been ambitious in different directions. The most famous example we have already discussed is Apple and Onion, which was, in effect, a Gumball alumni project transposed into a different premise. But there are many others, in shorts, in commercials, in pitches, that have or have not been picked up by streaming services. The broader pattern is one of slow diffusion. The Gumball approach to comedy and pacing and emotional honesty is now widely distributed across the animation labor pool. It will keep showing up, in modified forms, for as long as those people are working. This diffusion is, in some ways, the opposite of the ripoff problem. Where the obvious ripoffs took the surface and not the soul, the alumni diffusion is taking the soul and giving it new surfaces. A show made by a former Gumball storyboard artist may look nothing like Gumball, and may not, in any direct sense, be borrowing from Gumball. But the rhythms of the comedy, the willingness to let characters be quiet, the trust in the audience to pick up on small visual or emotional details, all of these may carry over. That kind of carrying over is not theft. It is just what happens when craft gets passed on. The animation industry has always worked this way. The The Disney veterans of the 1950s seeded everything that came after them. The Bakshi veterans of the 70s seeded their own pockets of the industry. The Pixar veterans of the early 2000s have, in turn, seeded a generation of computer animation work all over the world. Gumball has its own little pool of seeded talent now, and the things that pool produces over the next 10 or 15 years will be one of the more interesting stories in animation, even if, on the surface, most of those things will not look anything like Gumball. The streaming era complicates this whole picture in ways that are still being worked out. Gumball aired during a period when the linear television schedule was still the dominant way that children encountered animated shows. Episodes premiered in slots, were repeated, lived on the schedule for weeks at a time, and built audiences over months. The shows accused of ripping Gumball off, in most of the cases we have discussed, were also linear television shows. They were competing for the same kinds of slots on rival networks. The rip-off economy of the early to mid-2010s was, in a real sense, a linear television phenomenon. You could see the rivalry, channel by channel, schedule by schedule, week by week. By the late 2010s and the early 2020s, the way children watched cartoons had changed substantially. The streaming services entered the children's animation market with enormous budgets and very different priorities. The shows they were commissioning were, in some cases, much more original and much more ambitious than the rip-off economy had been producing. In other cases, they were continuing the same patterns, just at a larger scale and with more global reach. The Gumball-influenced look did not vanish in the streaming era. If anything, it became one of the available visual options that streaming originals could draw on, in the same way that the broader industry had absorbed it. But the urgency of the rip-off conversation faded somewhat, because the structural economics of streaming did not require networks to chase a single hit with a single style as aggressively as the linear television economy had required. The pace of new commissions slowed. The pressure to fill schedule slots with cheap imitations decreased. The rip-off economy did not go away, but it stopped being the central engine driving the production of new children's animation. In its place, a different kind of imitation problem has been emerging, and this is one of the more recent developments in the broader Gumball legacy story. The rise of accessible generative tools for creating images, video, and short animated content has produced, on the various social video platforms, a new category of imitation that is much faster, much cheaper, and much harder to police than anything the linear television era ever produced. Some of this imitation involves direct use of Gumball characters, generated into new scenarios that the show itself would never have produced, often with strange and unsettling results. Some of it involves the broader Gumball look, with characters that are not the Wattersons but that are clearly designed to evoke the Wattersons, dropped into short narrative loops aimed at capturing attention on short-form video platforms. The legal and moral questions raised by this new category of imitation are still being debated, and the platforms themselves are still developing tools to address it. But its existence is, in some sense, the most extreme version of the rip-off problem we have been discussing. It takes the surface of Gumball and produces an infinite supply of cheap variations on that surface, and the deeper craft questions that Gumball cared so much about are completely absent from these variations. What is interesting about this new wave of imitation is what it suggests about the nature of the original. The fact that the surface of Gumball can be replicated very cheaply by machines, but the writing cannot, is a kind of natural experiment. It reveals, with brutal clarity, that the things which made Gumball special were never in the surface. The surface was always replicable. The writing was always the bottleneck. The new wave of machine imitation demonstrates this by producing endless content that has the look without the writing, and that, when you watch it, feels almost exactly as hollow as the worst of the international rip-offs we discussed earlier, except produced at 1,000 times the scale. The lesson is the same. You can take the costume off the show, but the body inside the costume is what made the costume mean anything in the first place. There is also, in the longer trail of Gumball imitation, a class of mobile games and apps that have lifted from the show in various ways, both legitimately, through official licensing, and illegitimately, through unauthorized use of designs and characters. The official Gumball mobile games are part of the broader Cartoon Network mobile ecosystem and are perfectly above board. The unauthorized ones are a more complicated story. There have been, at various times over the past decade, small developers releasing games that use clearly traced or near-traced Watterson family members in unrelated game premises. Some of these have been taken down quickly. Others have lingered on smaller app stores for longer. The pattern, here, is the same as in the other categories of imitation we have discussed. The brand has become recognizable enough that any small operator looking for a quick boost in download numbers can use a Watterson lookalike as bait. The economics are simple. The legal exposure is, for many of these operators, low, and the result is a small but persistent stream of unauthorized Gumball-adjacent content that has been moving through the various mobile ecosystems for years. We should also touch on the question of the upcoming continuation, because the existence of new official Gumball material on the horizon changes the texture of the ripoff conversation, even if only slightly. There has been a long-discussed continuation project that, depending on what you have read and when you read it, has been a movie, or a special, or a streaming revival, or some combination of all three. The exact status of this project has shifted over time, with various announcements and delays and changes of platform that we should not try to pin down too precisely tonight, because the details have not always been stable. What is verifiable is that the show's continuation has been in development in some form for several years, and that this development has involved many of the original creative team. The simple fact of the continuation being in the works has, in the period of waiting, refocused some of the older ripoff conversations. Audiences who were arguing about which mid-2010s cartoon was the worst Gumball ripoff have, in recent years, been more likely to talk about the upcoming new Gumball than about any of the old ripoffs at all. The discourse, like all discourse, moves on. Now we should circle back to a question that has been hanging over this essay since we discussed the Copycats episode, which is what the show itself, at its highest level, seemed to want the audience to take away from the existence of all these imitators. The Copycats episode is, in a real way, the only canonical statement the show ever made on the subject. It is the only place where the writers got to address, in their own voice, the ripoff industry that had grown up around them. Everything else we have been discussing is the work of fans, critics, and online essayists. The show itself only said one thing about all of this, and the thing it said is worth taking seriously. What the episode said, when you boil it down, is that the show was, on balance, more amused than angry. The Wattersons in the episode are, of course, irritated by their knockoff doubles, but they are also, in the show's typical comedic register, kind of pleased by them, because the existence of a ripoff is, in itself, a kind of compliment. You only get copied if you are doing something that other people want to copy. The presence of imitators, no matter how lazy, is evidence that the original was worth imitating. And the writers of Gumball, in choosing to make this episode at all, were acknowledging that they had reached the kind of cultural altitude where being copied was just part of the air they breathed. There is also an implied critique of the audience in the episode, which is, in some senses, the most pointed thing the show ever did on this subject. The Wattersons, watching their knockoff doubles, cannot stop watching. They are appalled and they are still watching. The implication, if you take it seriously, is that the ripoff industry exists because we, the viewers, keep tuning in to ripoffs. The networks keep producing them because there is an audience for them. There is an audience for them because, even when we know better, we will still sit down and consume a slightly worse version of a thing we already love, just because it is on, just because it is available, just because the algorithm put it in front of us. The writers, in the Copycats, are not letting us off the hook. The ripoffs are partly our fault. The economy of cheap imitation runs because audiences subsidize it, knowingly or not. That is, I think, the most useful thing Gumball ever said about all of this, and it is the place where this whole essay, in some senses, ought to end, even though we are still going to spend a while longer with the question. The ripoffs exist because the system produces them and because the audience consumes them. The original exists because, at some point, somebody decided to do the harder version of the job instead of the easier version. The harder version is rarer and slower and more expensive. The easier version is, mathematically, always going to be more common than the harder version. In any creative field, in any country, in any era. The interesting question is not how to eliminate the ripoffs, because the ripoffs are downstream of structural forces that no individual show can change. The interesting question is how to recognize the original when it appears, and how to support it when it does, and how to resist the urge to fill the same slot in your day with a cheaper version of something you already love. There is, before we move toward the close, a slightly different kind of ripoff to consider, which is the cartoon that did not steal Gumball's look but did, in a real way, attempt to inherit its position in the cultural ecosystem. These are the shows that arrived on Cartoon Network and other networks in the late 2010s with what was, more or less openly, an attempt to be the new Gumball, in the sense of being the network's flagship offbeat family comedy. They were not pitched as Gumball ripoffs. They were, in many cases, pitched as natural successors. But the language of the pitches, when we have heard it discussed in interviews and at industry panels, tended to mention Gumball quite often, as a kind of reference point for the tonal territory the new shows were hoping to occupy. The honest reckoning with these successor shows is that most of them did not work, not because they were bad ideas, but because they were attempting something genuinely difficult, and because the conditions that made Gumball work were partly contingent on a specific moment in the industry. Gumball benefited from a network that was willing to take a chance on a strange visual concept. It benefited from a creative team that had the time to develop the look across multiple iterations before settling on what we now think of as the Gumball style. It benefited from a long enough run that the audience could grow with it. The successor shows often did not have these advantages. They were given shorter development cycles, shorter initial orders, and less time to find their footing. Some of them might have grown into something genuinely interesting, given the same room that Gumball was given. They were not given that room, and so they did not. This is, in some sense, a more sympathetic version of the ripoff conversation. The shows that tried to be the new Gumball were not lazy. They were not stealing. They were, in most cases, sincerely attempting to do the kind of work that Gumball had made possible. They failed, in part, because the industry that birthed them was a different industry from the one that had birthed Gumball, and the differences were not in their favor. Streaming was eating linear television. Budgets were tightening at the cable networks. Greenlight processes were getting more cautious. The window in which a strange and ambitious children's cartoon could be given the runway it needed was closing. Gumball had snuck through that window before it closed. Most of its would-be successors did not. Among the legacy of this period, there are a small handful of shows that came genuinely close to inheriting some part of Gumball's role, and that deserve to be remembered better than they currently are. We have already talked about Harvey Beaks, which got close on the emotional side. We have already talked about Apple and Onion, which got close on the visual side. There are others, smaller ones, that have largely been forgotten now, that briefly aired on satellite networks or streaming platforms in the late 2010s, and that, in their own modest ways, were trying to keep the spirit of Gumball alive while the industry was busy moving on. Some of these shows are still findable, in obscure corners of streaming catalogs or on the international YouTube channels of their parent companies. Some of them are essentially lost, having aired briefly and never been put up for streaming at all. The longer this essay goes on, the more I find myself wanting to tell people to go and look for these forgotten shows, not because they are masterpieces, but because they represent a kind of creative effort that the system did not always reward, and that, in retrospect, was more honest than most of the famous ripoffs we have been criticizing. There is a final group of cartoons that we should mention, briefly, because they have come up repeatedly in fan conversations about Gumball influence, even though their relationship to Gumball is, in most cases, almost entirely tonal. These are the cartoons that have used Gumball's lessons about combining comedy with sincere emotion to make shows about much more difficult material than Gumball ever attempted. We are talking, here, about the broader family of late 2010s animated shows that took the idea of using cartoon characters to address real emotional and psychological subject matter and pushed it into territory that Gumball, for all its ambition, never quite went into. Shows about mental illness, about grief, about complex family dynamics, about the strange and lonely experience of being a child in a confusing world. These shows are not ripoffs of Gumball, in any sense that the word ripoff usually carries, but they are, in their own way, downstream of the broader permission that Gumball helped to create on Western children's television. They are part of the same lineage. They are part of the same long conversation. And it is a sign of how successful Gumball really was that the most interesting cartoons of the last few years often owe it something, even when they look nothing like it and feel nothing like it, and are talking about things it never talked about. We should also, before we move much further, talk about the actual texture of the original show, because we have spent so much time discussing what other shows tried to imitate that we have not really stopped to describe what those shows were imitating. Gumball, when you watch it now, holds up in a way that surprises people who have not seen it for a few years. The animation is intricate, the writing is, in places, genuinely sharp. The performances, from the voice cast, are committed in a way that you can hear in every line. The show takes its world seriously enough that the comedy lands, and it takes its comedy seriously enough that the world feels real. These are not small achievements. They are the result of, by all accounts, a production process that was unusually careful for a network children's cartoon of its era. The episodes took longer to make than the production schedules were really designed for. The creative team pushed back against shortcuts. The visual style was protected, episode after episode, from the natural drift that long-running cartoons usually suffer. The result, when you watch the show now, is something that feels almost handmade, in a way that most contemporary children's animation does not. You can see the care in the frames. You can see the time that was spent on the way a particular photograph was integrated into a particular shot. You can see the choices about which character to put where on screen during a conversation, and the way those choices interact with the comedy. These are details that most viewers never consciously notice, but they are the details that distinguish a show that is doing the work from a show that is performing the work for the camera. Gumball was, almost throughout its run, doing the work. That is the thing the Ripoffs could not copy, and that is, in the end, the thing the show should be remembered for, more than any of the visual signatures or any of the catchphrases. Going back to the question of how the imitators failed, the failure modes split into a few distinct categories, and it is worth taking a moment to lay them out, because they tell us something about what an audience actually needs from a show in order to stay with it. The first failure mode is what we might call the surface failure, where the show borrows the look but cannot match the writing. Pickle and Peanut is the textbook case here. The visual signals are present, but the show beneath them is hollow. The audience clicks in and clicks out, and the show fades. The second failure mode is what we might call the energy failure, where the show borrows the absurdism but cannot match the heart. Breadwinners and Sanjay and Craig sit somewhere in this category. The shows have plenty of comedic energy. They have plenty of weird ideas. They have plenty of fast pacing and loud noises. What they do not have is the underlying emotional architecture that makes the energy land. The energy in Gumball is grounded in family. The energy in the failures is not grounded in anything. It is just energy, and energy without grounding is exhausting rather than exciting. The third failure mode is what we might call the conceptual failure, where the show borrows the structure but cannot match the specificity. Bunsen falls into this category. The show has a clear high concept that maps neatly onto a sentence. There is a monster going to a human school. The structure is there. The pieces are arranged in roughly the right order, but the specificity, the small details that make a fictional world feel alive, is missing. The town that Bunsen lives in does not feel like a real place, the way Elmore feels like a real place. The classmates that Bunsen knows do not feel like real classmates the way Gumball's classmates feel like real classmates. The whole show feels like it is operating one level of abstraction higher than it should be, and that abstraction is fatal to a comedy that depends on the audience caring about its world. The fourth failure mode is what we might call the prestige failure, where the show is so focused on being respected or being a hit that it cannot relax into being a good show. Some of the unmade pitches we were discussing earlier seem to have fallen into this category, although it is hard to be precise about pitches we cannot watch. The pattern, when it occurs, is that the show feels engineered for success rather than crafted for an audience. The writers are second-guessing themselves. The designers are playing it safe. The whole production gives off a kind of cautious smell, and the audience can sense it, even if they cannot articulate it. Gumball, for almost its entire run, managed to avoid all four of these failure modes. It had the surface and the writing. It had the energy and the heart. It had the structure and the specificity. And it had, throughout, the willingness to take risks that less confident shows would not have taken. There were episodes that were entirely silent. There were episodes that broke their own format completely. There were episodes that ended on emotional notes that no other comedy on Cartoon Network would have allowed themselves to land on. The show, by its later seasons, had become genuinely strange, in ways that an imitator would have to be very brave to try to follow. Most of them did not follow. They stayed in the safer middle of what Gumball had done, copying the photographed backgrounds and the family configuration, while never going near the wilder corners of the show's later experimentation. That is, in some ways, the cleanest measure of how serious any given imitation was. The ones that copied only the safest parts of Gumball were the laziest imitators. The ones that, however imperfectly, tried to learn from the riskier parts of Gumball were the more honest imitators, even when they failed. The Russian and Eastern European cases are worth touching on briefly, although they tend to be even less documented than the Chinese and Indian cases. There have been, at various points over the past decade, animations produced in Russia and in various other Eastern European countries that have shown clear traces of Gumball influence, sometimes in character design, sometimes in mixed media approach, sometimes in tonal mimicry. Most of these are small projects, often aired on local satellite channels or local streaming platforms, and most of them have never reached an English-speaking audience. Their existence is generally documented through fan reports rather than through any kind of systematic survey, and the details of which specific shows are involved tend to be fuzzy in the broader online conversation. We are not going to try to name specific titles tonight, both because the documentation is uncertain and because the point we are making does not really depend on the specifics. The point is that, in any market where Gumball was syndicated, there have been local producers who have, with varying degrees of subtlety, attempted to make their own version of the show for their local audience. This is, in some sense, just the global animation market doing what it has always done. Latin American animation has, during the same period, gone in a somewhat different direction. There has been less pure Gumball imitation in Latin American children's animation than in some of the other regions, but there has been a significant amount of work that has been influenced by Gumball's tonal approach, applied to specifically Latin American settings and concerns. Some of the more interesting recent Latin American animation, particularly in countries with active local industries, has been doing what we earlier called the graceful version of inheritance, learning from Gumball's lessons without copying its specifics. This is, again, what cultural exchange in animation looks like at its best, and it is one of the reasons to be optimistic about the broader long-term legacy of the show. The aggressive ripoffs are the visible end of Gumball's influence. The graceful inheritances are the more important end, and they are, by their nature, harder to see at first glance, because they do not look like Gumball, and they are not trying to. There is another small but interesting category we should mention, which is the use of Gumball-influenced aesthetics in indie video games. The broader indie game scene has, over the past decade, included a number of games that have used flat character designs over photographed or composited backgrounds, in styles that owe at least something to Gumball. Some of these games are charming. Some of them are very specifically influenced by Gumball in ways the developers have acknowledged in interviews. Some of them are using a more general visual vocabulary that, while it includes some Gumball elements, is also drawing on other sources, including older indie game traditions of mixed media collage. The crossover between indie game aesthetics and children's animation aesthetics is one of the more interesting underexplored corners of the broader visual culture of the 2010s and the early 2020s. Gumball sits in the middle of that crossover, having influenced and been influenced by the broader visual language of the era, in ways that the formal ripoff conversation does not usually capture. I want to come back, for a moment, to the Copycats episode, because the more I sit with this whole topic, the more I think the episode is the secret center of the entire conversation. Not just because it is the only on-screen acknowledgement of the ripoff industry by the show itself, but because the way it handles its premise gives away something important about how Gumball understood its own place in the industry, and by extension, how it understood the relationship between any creative work and the imitators that gather around it. The episode is, on its surface, a comedy. Like all Gumball episodes, it is built out of jokes, escalating absurdities, and the kind of last-act emotional pivot that the show was so consistently good at landing. But the chosen subject of the comedy is striking, because the show could very easily have decided to address its imitators in a number of different ways. It could have made a sarcastic episode, dunking on specific competitors. It could have made a defensive episode, asserting its own originality. It could have made a smug episode, congratulating itself on its primacy. It did not do any of these things. What it did, instead, was to make an episode that was, on close inspection, about the experience of being a public thing, of having lost control of your own image, to the extent that other people are now making cheap versions of you for profit. That experience is, in some ways, the actual condition of any work that becomes culturally significant. The work is no longer just itself. It is also a kind of brand, a kind of template, a kind of available pattern that other actors in the broader economy can use to do their own thing. The work has, in some sense, escaped the people who made it, and the people who made it now have to live with the version of the work that is held in the broader culture, which always includes some amount of distortion and imitation and misuse. The episode lets this experience sit in the family, rather than in any single character, which is, I think, one of its quieter and smarter choices. The whole family has to deal with the existence of the knockoff. The mother and the father, the children, all of them are in different ways, grappling with the fact that there is now another version of their family in the world, doing things their family would not do, saying things their family would not say, and yet looking just enough like them to be confused with them by people who are not paying close attention. The metaphor extends in obvious directions to the show itself, of course. The Wattersons standing in for the Gumball production team, the knockoff standing in for the ripoff industry. But the metaphor also extends, more subtly, to anyone who has ever had to live with the version of themselves that exists in the minds of other people, which is, of course, all of us, in our own, much smaller ways. Public people deal with this constantly. Private people deal with it occasionally. The experience of being misread, misrepresented, or misused by people who do not know you, but who think they do, is one of the universal conditions of being a recognizable entity in any social space. The episode finds the universal in the specific, which is, in the end, what good comedy almost always does. It is also worth noting, because we are being careful throughout to distinguish between canon and interpretation, that the reading I am giving you of the Copycats is my reading, and that the show itself does not narrate its own meaning out loud. The show implies, the viewer interprets. What I am calling the secret center of the conversation might, in the show's own intention, be a much simpler joke than I am making it sound. The writers might have just thought it would be funny to have the family yell at a fake version of themselves. The deeper layer of meaning that I am reading into the episode is the kind of meaning that essays like this one tend to read into things, sometimes correctly and sometimes overconfidently. I am offering it as a possibility, not as a verdict. The economy of animation, taken as a whole, is going to continue to produce both originals and ripoffs in roughly the same ratio that it always has, which is to say, a small number of originals and an enormous number of ripoffs, with the boundary between the two categories blurry and contested. New shows that are accused of ripping Gumball off will keep appearing, particularly as the visual signatures of the show continue to live in the broader vocabulary of the industry. Some of them will deserve the accusation, some of them will not. The arguments will continue. The comparison videos will continue. The forum threads will continue. The conversation will keep restarting itself, with new examples and new participants, for as long as Gumball remains in the broader cultural conversation, which will probably be a very long time. That is the price of being a show that people care about. The conversation does not stop. The original stays in the center of it. The imitators come and go around the edges. It is worth saying, very plainly, in the spirit of being clear about uncertainty wherever we can, that the future of the broader Gumball property is something none of us can fully predict at the moment. The continuation project, in whatever final form it takes, will introduce new material that will, in turn, become a new reference point for future imitators. The streaming environment will keep evolving. The economic conditions of children's animation will keep changing. The kinds of shows that get made and the kinds of shows that get canceled will keep shifting in response to whatever the broader market is doing at any given moment. The conversation we have been having tonight is, in some sense, a snapshot of one particular phase in the longer history of the show and its influence. The phase we are in now, where the original is essentially complete and the formal sequel is on the horizon, will give way to another phase, in which we are dealing with new material and new questions, and probably some new imitators. That is fine. That is how cultural objects of any duration work. The conversation will keep evolving, and we will keep adapting our framework as new things appear that need explaining. For now, though, The framework we have outlined holds together pretty well. The ripoffs we have cataloged are the ones that have been most discussed in the broader online conversation, and the analysis we have offered for each of them tries to be honest about both what they were trying to do and where they fell short. The conclusions we have drawn about the nature of style, the limits of imitation, and the deeper sources of original work in animation are conclusions that should remain useful, even as the specific examples shift over the coming years. The principles are the things that travel. The examples are the things that change. And, if we have been useful at all tonight, it has been by giving you a set of principles that you can carry into whatever new examples come up over the next few years, and that will let you make your own honest assessments of which new shows deserve which labels. We have, almost, reached the end. There is a particular feeling that comes with finishing a long essay about a long-running show, especially one that you love. It is a kind of melancholy, mixed with gratitude, mixed with the awareness that the show is going to keep producing conversations for years after you have stopped writing about it tonight. The conversation we have had has been about ripoffs, but the conversation underneath has been about love, and the way love expresses itself even in the failures of imitators who tried and could not quite manage to capture what the original captured. The original is, in some sense, the only protagonist of the story we have told. The imitators are supporting characters. Some of them are sympathetic, some of them are not, but all of them, in the end, exist to define the shape of the protagonist by surrounding it with the shape it is not. That is the structure of the story. That is, in some ways, the structure of every story about influence and imitation in any creative field. The original sits in the center. The imitators arrange themselves around it. And the longer you look, the more clearly you can see the original through the negative space the imitators provide. So, before we step into the outro proper, here is a small benediction for the show we have been talking about. May Gumball continue to be discovered by new viewers for as many years as the streaming services will let it stay available. May the people who made the show continue to find creative work that they enjoy and that they are proud of. May the ripoffs, when they come, be at least sincere in their borrowing, even if they cannot match the original in execution. And may the conversation around the show continue to be conducted with the kind of attention and care that the show itself deserves, rather than the easy reflex labeling that is sometimes the closest the broader internet can come to actual criticism. The show earned the conversation. The least we can do, as the audience, is keep the conversation honest. That is, in the end, what I have tried to do tonight, with whatever success and whatever failures the attempt has involved. There is one final, quiet thought I want to leave you with before we move into the closing, and it is this. The reason that ripoffs sting, when they sting, is not because they steal anything from the original. The original does not, in fact, lose anything when somebody else makes a cheap version of it. The original still exists. The original is still available. The original is still doing its work every time anyone watches it, regardless of what any imitator is doing on a different channel. The reason ripoffs sting is that they remind us, painfully, of how rare the original is. They remind us that the things we love are not as easy to make as we sometimes assume. They remind us that, for every show like Gumball that actually exists, there are dozens of would-be Gumballs that did not work, and that, in a slightly different world, the original itself might have been one of the ones that did not work either. The fact of its existence is, in some ways, a small miracle. The ripoffs, by failing to be it, remind us of the miracle, and force us to be grateful for it. That gratitude, in the end, is the only response that really makes sense. Grateful that the show exists. Grateful that it was made by people who cared. Grateful that we got to watch it. Grateful that, even now, years after its original run, we are still here, talking about it, comparing it to its imitators, and finding that the imitators have not, in the end, taken anything away from it at all. If you have made it this far, thank you for staying with the essay. The ripoffs, as a phenomenon, are mostly an unhappy story, and turning that story into something restful is in some ways the entire job of this video. The hope is that you have been able to drift in and out of attention as the essay moved along, picking up the bits that interested you and letting the rest carry you towards sleep. The original show, with all of its strangeness and care, is going to keep being there in the morning. The imitators will mostly have faded by then. That, in the end, is the right balance. The thing that matters lasts. The things that did not matter so much will quietly disappear. and the world will continue to be one in which a small, ambitious cartoon, made in a London studio out of rejected character designs and budget photographs, became something that an entire generation of viewers will remember for the rest of their lives. The Amazing World of Gumball was a show that, for almost a decade, took children's animation more seriously than it strictly needed to. It is a show that gave the family on the screen the same care that the best live-action sitcoms give their families. It is a show that, against all the easier paths the industry might have offered it, chose the harder one, the slower one, the more attentive one, and that, by doing so, set a standard that the rest of its decade tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to match. The Ripoffs are the visible record of that attempt. The failure of the Ripoffs is, paradoxically, one of the clearest measures of how much the original achieved. That, in a way, is the only conclusion this essay can really reach. The Ripoffs failed because the original was that good. The original was that good because it cared more than the imitators were ever willing to. And the caring, in the end, was the show. Everything else was just the costume the caring wore on its way out into the world, where it would be watched and loved and copied and remembered for years longer than anyone, at the start, would have expected. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.